Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Did everyone check their sound? Do you want to do a quick sound check and make sure you're working? So I can just call you as I see you on my
Hey,
screen.
this is Full Cash. Martine, I couldn't hear you for the last bit of it, so you may want to.
You couldn't hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so let me know if you can't hear me. I never wear this thing at any point, and you can type in the chat too. So do you guys want to do a sound check really quickly before we get started? We have a couple minutes. So Lynn.
Hello.
Perfect. Bogan.
Hi.
Perfect. Josephson.
Hey there.
Okay. Antiru.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, and now your name is only showing me Michelle and part of your last name. It cuts off.
Hi.
Perfect. Brambit.
Morning.
Morning. Yee.
Morning.
Okay. O'Leary.
Here.
Perfect. Jawar.
Hello.
Hello. Burkhart.
Hello.
Good. Ma.
Hi.
Rodriguez.
Good morning.
Morning. Lahiri.
Hi.
Hi. Okay. Wadwa.
Hi.
Hi. Paltzik.
Hi.
Okay. Khan.
Hi.
And Mazumdar.
Right here.
Perfect. Did I miss anyone? You rearranged on my screen as we were going through. So, okay, perfect. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And first, I have our two candidates for, you're not going to be able to see that, are you? You cannot see their names. So I was supposed to make it. So here you go. Here's Antiru. Here's O'Leary, right? These are our two candidates. So I'm folding them up and I am just mixing them around. So we're not doing a coin flip. We're just randomly doing this. Okay, so here is our first, you can see it's O'Leary. Okay, so you'll be the PO for our first session. And then Antiru, you will do session 2 this afternoon. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be your PO this session. I am Representative O'Leary. That's O'Leary spelled O-L-E-A-R-Y. It's going to be on my placard and on the screen. And just before we start, as of course we're adapting to a new technological medium, I want to start off with a brief moment of silence for all of those who have been impacted by coronavirus. Okay, thank you everybody for doing that with me. But anyways, just so that I could, obviously I'm going to be as fast, fair, and efficient as possible. When it comes to timing and questioning, that's really how we're going to get down to that. So whenever you're at 2 minutes during your speech, I'm going to hold up the placard that says 2 minutes. When you're at 2 minutes and 30 seconds, I will hold up a placard that says 2 minutes and 30 seconds. When you're at 2 minutes and 55 seconds, I will hold up the 2 minutes and 55 placard. When you're at 3:05, I will hold up the placard that says please conclude. Let me just get it over here. Please conclude. And at 3:10, I will cut you off just so that we can make sure that we're as efficient as possible, especially with any technological issues that we might run into. Anyways, now that we've gone over timing for speeches, for questioning, that's going to be a little bit different. So obviously we're working in 30-second blocks for direct questioning, right? So we're going to start with 30 seconds for everybody in questioning. And towards the last 5 seconds, I'm going to count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I will go like this at the end with a fist to make sure that you're ending your questioning period. I'll give you a brief second to finish your thought, and then we'll move on to the next questioner abruptly. Anyways, those are how I'm going to be timing. And the one thing that I recommend, just to ensure that we don't have any issues with timing, is that either A, you time yourself, or B, pin me on the screen whenever you're speaking or you're questioning, just so that you know what time you're at, because that's going to be really important in order to ensure that we're moving as efficiently as possible. Anyways, I'm pretty sure I know how to pronounce most of your names in this round. Do all of you have a placard? I just want to make sure. Everybody, can you just please raise your placards really fast? That looks like everybody, but if I missed someone, just make sure that you make one before we get into the round so that I can pronounce your names better. And if I mispronounce your name at all, please feel free to correct me. I will not be offended at all. Anyways, for speaking, I will be first working off of randomness when selecting on speakers. Once precedence and recency are established, I'm going to work off precedence and then recency. And then finally, for questioning, I'm going to be picking questioners based first off of randomness. Then once precedence is established, I'm going to be based off precedence. Now for direct questioning, I'm going to do my best to try and work with recency as well, but that can definitely be tougher to keep track of than questioning precedence. So I'll do my best with that, but just in terms of, it's going to be mostly based off precedence. Anyways, that's really the basis of how I'm going to be POing. Does anybody have any questions before we get into round? Representative Bogan?
I just had a motion.
Motion?
Open the floor for docket nominations.
Is there a second? Just raise your placard. Whenever there's a second, just raise your placard. And that looks unanimous, so we'll open the floor for docket nominations. All those with a docket, please raise your placards. We'll start with Mr. Jawar. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I nominate docket A, which consists of first, section 2F1B, a bill to reform sections 301 through 310 of the Trade Act of 1974. Second, SF1C, a bill to benefit Americans instead of large organizations in unsettling times. And then third, SF1A, the Community Development Financial Institutions Reform Act of 2020.
Okay, so that is docket A. Once again, to repeat that, that is SF2, which is the Trade Act, SF3, which is large organizations and American individuals, and SF1, which is CFDIs. Are there any other motions and or docket nominations? Mr. Bogan.
I move to close the floor for docket nominations.
Is there a second? Just raise your placard. That looks to be everybody, so I'm going to assume unanimous consent, and that will be the established docket. Anyways, Mr. Ontario, do you have a motion?
Point of information.
Point of information.
Per TOC procedure, recency for both speeches and questions reset from session 1 to session 2, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so are there any other points of information just so we can start the round? All good? Mr. Mazumdar?
Yeah, how would you like us to motion for points of privilege? And would you like us to motion again when coming back in?
Oh, right. Okay, so there's two ways that you can do it. So if you hold up, if you hold up this symbol or a thumbs up or anything behind your placard, I will make sure to call on you for a point of personal privilege. And if I miss that because I'm picking a questioner, you can also type it into the chat and I will grant it in the chat. When you re-enter, just do either the same procedure and I will grant it either in the chat if I miss it, or I will make sure to be as vigilant as possible when looking for people who motion for a point of personal privilege before a speaker starts. But anyways, either way, if you are going to type into the chat, make sure you do it either before or after a speaker starts. So that's a point of personal privilege procedure. Ms. Brombot, do you have a motion or a point?
A point. So to clarify, when we want to stand to speak or question, we use the participants area and raise our hand, correct?
Yes. So okay. So if you want to motion, just really fast to go over this. If you want to do a motion for now on, raise your hands like this with the placard, just so I know that you have a motion. When you want to speak and or ask a question, just raise your placard like normal. If you want to motion for a point of personal privilege, make a hand signal like this or a thumbs up, or type it into the chat and I will make sure to grant it. Anyways, anything else before we start?
Mr. Speaker or President, if we're a Senate, I'm noticing some observers in chamber. We are closing our chambers to observers today. However, on YouTube, we are streaming all of the congressional debate chambers. So if the observers would please exit the chamber before I have to forcibly remove you, that would be awesome. And if it's not linked on the front page of the tab room site, we will have that shortly, and I'm going to blast out an email with that link very quickly. Okay. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you for that information. Anyways, so now that we've covered that, Mr. Ontiru.
Thank you. One last point of information. for direct questioning, are you going to try and keep hard recency, or are you basing it purely on precedence?
Okay, so I'm going to do my best to keep recency as well as precedence. It's going to be first based off precedence and then based off recency if two people have the same precedence, however. So it's going to be precedence and then recency. Anyways, now do we have any more points of information before we open the floor for debate? Okay, so seeing that, we will now unilaterally open the floor for debate on SF2, which is reforming sections 301 to 310 of the Trade Act. Is there an authorship present? Mr. Khan, did I see your placard raised?
I have a point of information point of inquiry. Is it an author or sponsor?
I'm just calling for authorships first based off of just procedure. There shouldn't be, I know nobody in here has actually written the legislation. It's just based off procedure. I'm going to move on to sponsorship. Anyways, is there any sponsorships present? Miss Yee.
I thank the chair. For those above me, I'm Senator Yee, spelled Y-E. As always, at the leisure of Parley and my two judges, and of course my PO.
PO is always ready.
Great. Sorry, all of the grids are separated into two slides. Was that yes for, is anyone not ready? Okay. Ceteris paribus. That's a Latin economic phrase meaning all other things remain constant and stands for the impacts that today's negation will bring up. But they fail to realize that things only remain constant when we have complete control over the economy. But with today's status quo, our economics have been changing too much and the casualties lie within our constituents. Pass. First, let's look at the issue and the status quo. In 2017, Donald Trump chose Robert Lighthizer to serve as the US Trade Representative in his cabinet. The media went wild with ideas that Trump hired Lighthizer to win a trade war. Trump essentially did pave the way for Lighthizer to do this. But almost 3 years later, Lighthizer has nothing to show except an escalating trade war with the world's quickly growing second largest economy. We all know China. Wendy Wu of South China Morning Post tells us in January of 2019 that Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act is one of Washington's most effective weapons in bringing pressure on Beijing. Before Trump fired the first shot in this trade war in April of 2018, Lighthizer produced a report that China was engaging in unfair trade policies. All of Trump's further retaliation stemmed from this one report that ripped Beijing apart and painted them as a slaughterer of capitalism. Beijing actually ended up challenging the use of Section 301 at meetings of the World Trade Organization. But who are the actual casualties of the trade war that Lighthizer and Trump created? The casualties are your constituents who voted for you to represent your state. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost jobs, including farmers and small business owners. When you fail today's legislation, you betray your constituents because you continue to stand for the status quo where the trade representative and the president have full reign. Even if you argue that in 5 years, Trump isn't the one holding the presidential office, you effectively give me a timeline of 5 years before anything changes, and I can't stand for that. Pass. So next, let's talk about why today's legislation solves for exactly that. At the point where the United States due process questioned by the first country on our target trade list, we pass. Section A of today's legislation mandates that we, as the Congress, now have oversight over the actions of the U.S. Trade Representative. It can no longer take unilateral retaliatory action following Section 301, but Section 2C states that if we have officially declared war on the foreign government, the USTR may launch an investigation without our approval. Here's why that's so important. We maintain effective oversight without ever putting the lives of our constituents in jeopardy, because when it matters the most, the USTR can still act quickly to protect them. When we pass today's legislation, we start to pave the way for increased oversight of the Trade Expansion Act. This even includes Section 232, which gives the president the power to impose restrictions on foreign trade. When you pass, you stand for the new mindset that refuses to allow our president and our trade representative from destroying our foreign policy and international relations. Pass.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 7 seconds. Questioners, please rise for a 2-minute period of questioning. That will go first to Mr. Mazumdar, and then Ms. Brombaut, and then Mr. Rodriguez, and then Ms. Lahiri.
Thank you. So you spent your first point talking about all the problems that Lighthizer has actually arisen, but why are we giving him the ability to approve or reject congressional exclusion requests under this legislation?
Right, so in the status quo, that happens because in these times we want to act quickly. And so we give one person all of that responsibility. But the thing is, we haven't even declared war on China, and we've already enacted.
I'm asking you, if you have a problem with Lighthizer's decision making, why are you giving him unilateral control to approve or deny Congress's requests?
But that's literally not what happens with today's legislation.
Under Section 2B, it happens. It says
we're saying it goes through us first, and that's what we're changing.
But he gets the final say, right?
But we're the ones who initiate it. That's the issue, because he's the one with the only power to do so.
Questioning period is over, Ms. Brombaut.
So tariffing is an example of the executive's foreign policy powers, right? It's an extension. Correct. So under the Constitution, wouldn't this be unconstitutional because now another agency is handling the foreign policy power of the executive?
Not at all. The only reason why we're passing today's legislation is because all of those actions that have been taken are only through.
Right, but tariffing has always been an executive power.
Right, and we're seeing abuse of that power in the status
Mr.
quo.
Rodriguez.
Hi, so essentially this bill gives more power to Congress than the executive when it comes to tariffs, right?
Sure.
If Congress has historically voted more on party lines and actual policy, why is it beneficial to give Congress more power?
Right. So you're not going to let the mentality of party lines stop you from passing today's legislation, because when it actually matters, all of us stand for our constituents. We're here to pass legislation and pass acts.
Wait, you're telling me Congress is more likely to vote for actual constituents than party lines?
Yes, because that's what we're here for.
Thank you. The president appoints the USTR, right?
Correct.
Okay, so they're probably on the same page.
Correct.
Okay, so when the USTR's power is limited, what happens to the president? Do they get mad?
Essentially, possibly, yeah.
Okay, so how do they retaliate?
Against us?
Just in general.
Well, they're not going to, because we're the
ones.
ones.
Wait, they get mad, but they don't do anything about it?
Wait, they're not going to get mad at us because we're the ones.
You just said that they would retaliate.
But I was confused about what you were saying, but they're not going to retaliate because we're the ones passing.
Questioning period has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves, seeing as that was a first affirmation. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Bogan.
I thank the chair. For the judges, that's Jonathan Bogan, spelled B-O-G-E-N, speaking for the first time this session on the negation of today's legislation. I'm now at the leisure of my judges, presiding officer, whenever you guys are ready. Good. Good. And everyone good? All right. In a world driven by supply and demand, this Congress has shown time and time again that fiscal policy is not its moneymaker. We've gone so far from the books that self-serving seems to be the only word in our vocabulary. Now, I want this legislation to be a cheat sheet to foreign policy just as much as the next guy. But if you pass this bill, you're going to really wish you studied beforehand. So let's start today's class by talking about how this bill undermines fair negotiations. This occurs because we force reliance upon the World Trade Organization's dispute system. The Peterson Institute for International Economics writes on August 3rd of 2017, alongside Section 301 disputes exists the WTO settlement system, which was used to bring nations together to peacefully resolve issues. But that's a D+ impact, because the United States no longer has the ability to fare well in those negotiations. The Atlantic Council writes on June 14th of 2019, since President Trump's use of tariffs against China, the WTO has pushed back against US policy. Its settlement panel recently even gave itself the power to determine the legality of tariff installations, seen as a backdoor to block American steel tariffs. But Ms. Yee says that it's the US trade representative's fault that we're in this trade war, when that's patently false. President Trump used Section 232 sanctions to put China under our economic grip, not Section 301. This legislation has absolutely nothing to do with the trade war. But when you pass this bill, that situation only gets worse. It's evident that the World Trade Organization is resentful of us and will take unprecedented action to stop our policy. That's no environment for fair negotiations to be taking place in. But with this legislation, it becomes our only option. It doesn't take Econ 101 to see when the scales are clearly tipped against us. But now let's move on to the next lesson and see how this legislation incinerates US trade policy. This occurs because we delegate discretionary power to Congress. James Goldgeier of American University writes on August 14th of 2018, in Congress, declining foreign policy expertise has reduced the ability of legislatures to manage US relations. The bureaucracy has continuously failed to wield experts and direct them towards Congress. That very scenario makes this chamber a dangerous place for foreign policy decisions. Philip Fernbach found in his Harvard University study that political extremism is fed by a lack of understanding. Compared to individuals who actually learned about a policy, those who merely stated their reasons for support were 33% more extreme in their views of that very policy. When you pass today's legislation, Ms. Yee, you can't pave the path for better policy and negotiations and even regulating Section 232 for the primary reason that we're giving an unexperienced Congress the responsibility to regulate foreign policy. When you pass this bill, you allow the congressional brain drain to take hold in our chamber, ensure that we have less negotiations, less cooperation, and more voting along party lines. That's seriously problematic when we need to make the best decisions for our people. So in the end, class may be over, but I hope I've taught you all the lesson of a lifetime.
Speech time 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Questioners, please rise or raise your placards. That will go first to Ms. Yee, and then Ms. Ontiru, then Mr. Jawar, and then Ms. Wadwa.
All right, so what does Section 301 do?
Section 301 allows the United States to investigate other countries if they commit like unfair deals or violating trade negotiations.
Exactly, and did Lighthizer not use Section 301 to investigate China and the United States
President
trade
Trump instituted he used it after President Trump instituted Section 232 sanctions for reasons of
President Trump is only allowed to use Section 232 because the investigation was done.
Not at all. He can go through the
trade
Treasury
policies.
It's a completely separate part of the bureaucracy.
Mr. Ontiru.
Hi, Mr. Bogan. The USTR is in the executive branch, correct?
Yes.
So when they pass retaliatory policy, do they have to inform Congress of their rationale or any investigations?
Not at all, but that's non-unique.
Well, if they don't have to inform them, then why are you saying that Congress is bad at making foreign policy
Because
when
we
they don't have the information?
And passing this legislation doesn't get it back. We're just using more unexperienced Congress members.
No, I think it does, because under Section 1B, Congress is involved with investigation.
Mr. Jawar. To be involved, it doesn't happen under this.
Why don't we use the WTO system right now?
Well, because we have bad relations with them.
So what do we use in opposition or in replacement of it?
We either use Section 232 sanctions or Section 301 sanctions.
Okay, does this legislation get rid of either of those?
It doesn't get rid of it, but it makes it harder.
Okay, so why would we use the WTO system if we still have Section 301 tariffs? They just go through Congress first.
For us, the WTO is directly biased against us.
But we would still have Section 301.
Good morning, Senator. So when a 301 report is filed, exactly how must the USTR respond?
So the USTR has to engage in direct negotiations with that country
No,
immediately.
they don't actually get the option of negotiations. There's 3 steps, and the first step is tariffs.
If we can't have negotiations, which is better foreign policy, tariffs or negotiations?
That's not true. They have to engage in negotiations once they find out.
No, the first step is tariffs.
No, this first step is negotiations.
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Lin.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber, my name is Senator Lin. That is L-I-N, speaking on the affirmation. As always, nod or smile. I know the PO is always ready. All good. As my history teacher, Mr. Hull, would say, history repeats itself. The outbreak of the trade war has expedited all real wars in history, and the compass of precedent points to this. The Revolutionary War, World War I, World War II, all of these conflicts were hastened by trade conflict. And in this time of COVID-19, we need now more than ever to cooperate and work together. Therefore, my framing for today's debate is that we need to have the best outcome for American citizens, or as economists would say, maximize allocative efficiency and consumer surplus. The first reason why I stand on the affirmation is because this bill will reduce trade conflict and increase global cooperation. That's because giving the president unilateral trade power is a recipe for disaster. Now, Senator Bogan says that Trump did not use the USTR, and Senator Yi touched on how Section 301 is the instrument of trade war. So who is right? Let's ask the USTR. According to the USTR in 2018, they explicitly wrote that they used Section 301 as the instrument to declare a trade war against China. Therefore, evidently, Section 301 is a huge component in these trade war conflicts. Furthermore, according to Edward Alden with Foreign Policy, this has hugely negative repercussions. That's because trade war has even become more unpredictable with executive discretion. Without congressional oversight, it's easier for presidents to drag us in. Now, Senator Mazumdar asks why we would allow Lighthizer to get exclusionary discretion in cross. But with this bill, Lighthizer and the president can lower barriers at will, but need congressional approval to impose barriers. That will lead to a more stable marketplace for our country and our consumers, which is inherently more unstable than Senator Bogan's WTO. Now, Senator Bogan says that we're putting an unexperienced Congress in charge of foreign policy. But let's have another history lesson. Congress had discretion over trade policy until around the time of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This is not a radical idea, rather it's common sense. But the second reason why I stand on the affirmation is because this bill improves medical capacity. Now, Senator Yi started this debate with the Latin phrase ceteris paribus, and as a student of Latin, I'm obligated to give you another tidbit. One reason for Rome's meteoric rise was its roads, especially the Via Appia, which allowed for it to effectively transmit resources. But why does this matter to us now? The free flow of goods includes the free flow of ventilators. According to Daniel Griswold in March, Trump's policy has forced China to divert sales of these protective gear with hugely negative effects, especially through Section 301. Susan Shirk in March proceeds on this argument. China currently has 47,000 mask manufacturers, and they have a supply of 200 million facial masks. Just kidding, that's not their supply. That's their manufacturing capacity every single day. Many of us personally know doctors on the front line of this response. Our friends are exposing themselves to a risk of infection every single day, but they often need to reuse these masks. The less trade barriers we have, the more easy it is to have supplies we need to get to the front line. This is a time for cooperation and unity. History repeats itself, so let us not repeat our mistakes. Thank you.
Speech time is 3 minutes and 4 seconds. Now we'll move on to a 1-minute questioning block. Questioners, please raise your placards. Go first to Mr. Rodriguez and then Ms. Brombot.
Hey, I think you're muted.
Point of inquiry, wouldn't it go to Representative Bogan? I don't believe he has a question yet.
I'm sorry, yeah, that's correct. I have like part of my Google Doc hanging over the Zoom while I'm trying to keep recency, so sometimes I'm missing some stuff. So, okay, yeah. We'll go first to Mr. Rodriguez and then Mr. Bogan.
What does Section 4 of this legislation say?
You tell me.
Section 4 of this legislation says any current retaliatory tariffs would stay in place. How would this bill have any effect on the current trade war?
Essentially, right now, we need to reach a compromise, right? We're in a very precarious situation, and although Trump has led us down the wrong path, we as Congress need to make sure that it doesn't escalate any further. And by passing this bill, we're making sure we don't get dragged into future trade wars.
I completely agree with that. But if this bill doesn't remove tariffs, don't we see none of your impact come to fruition?
Mr. Bogan.
You're muted.
Hi, Senator. So using the path, so President Trump always uses a path of least resistance, correct?
Well, not always. I mean, just look at his Twitter account.
No, but like, which section does he use more, Section 232 or 301?
He uses both. I mean, you just
that's incorrect. Congressional research uses 232. So how does that have anything to do with this legislation?
I just gave you a press release where Trump declared war through 301. I don't know how that
started it through 301. Did he continue it through 301? Or
questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Ms. Lahiri.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber, that's Senator Lahiri, spelled Lahiri, speaking for the first time on the negative. Just a smile or nod when you're ready. Good. Okay, awesome. Ever since the 2016 presidential election, US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping have had a very interesting relationship. So interesting that just last week, an image was published of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump kissing. Now that truly redefines the term international affairs. Yet while the two may have a good relationship on paper, the reality is far more tenuous. Specifically, this legislation only stands to make this relationship all the worse, which is exactly why I am proud to negate. Allow me to offer a framework for this round. At the crux of this legislation, three key things occur which render it impossible to pass. First, Ms. Yee told us when I questioned her that the USTR is a mouthpiece for the president's power. If anything, this passing only amplifies the risk that the president uses the AUMF to a higher degree to up their own retaliatory power. But second, don't pass because the AUMF is always there as a caveat. This legislation literally writes its own circumvention mechanism. But third, two worlds occur when you pass. Either Congress has oversight, which is bad, or the AUMF gets emboldened when we pass, which is also bad. Miss Yee, congressional oversight versus AUMF empowerment doesn't set up a situation that embodies the status quo. It creates two unique, detrimental worlds. The first is when congressional oversight would be devastating regardless of who's in office. But here's where I'll distinguish myself from Mr. Bogan, because the issue goes far beyond voting on party lines. It has to do with Congress's fundamental ideologies. Passing the authority to trade deals back to Congress is deeply problematic, as Congress members are fundamentally risk averse and will almost always deny passing any efficient trade policy. Professor Yu at UC Berkeley explains in 2012 that no congressional member will authorize an efficient trade operation for the risk that the operation goes poorly and it's pinned against them for future re-election. Essentially, Congress members fear the American public will blame them if the operation goes awry. Mr. Lin, you gave us the smooth policy example. That policy took over 5 years to pass. Have an affirmative speaker give us a single instance where Congress passed anything swiftly, and maybe I'll be swayed. But let's say we do pass, and that infuriates the president and causes them to ramp up the AUMF. Mr. Lin, maybe there'll be fewer trade wars, but the implication is real conflict. The Washington Post explains that in 2019, that the AUMF has justified 37 unnecessary interventions, even on the basis of conflicting trade policy. That's bad for two reasons. First, Enterline of International Studies Quarterly evaluates 172 years of interventions in 2000 and quantifies that third-party intervention increases the risk of duration of conflict by 347% over the baseline. This is exactly why evidence indicates that 2 million people who are innocent died unjustly because of AUMF interventions. Second, the evidence from the USA Today of just last week explains that intervention stimulates anti-American sentiment by creating fear and chaos. That's catastrophic because this indicates that increases in terrorism only increased by 607%. Tariffs and trade deals rip the US and China apart. A pen and paper cannot piece them back together.
Thank you, Ms. Lahiri, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please rise or raise your placards. First to Mr. Josephson and then to Ms. Belyinsky.
Hey, Ms. Lahiri, you're impacting
Hi.
the AUMF, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so how many AUMFs do we have active right now?
I'm sure you can tell me.
Yeah, there's one, and do you know who it's against?
The Middle East.
No, it's not just against the Middle East. It's against the people who perpetrated 9/11, Al-Qaeda. How much trade do we have with Al-Qaeda right now?
So I think that indicates the exact problem, because
have
even
no
if the
trade
issue,
with
as you
Al-Qaeda,
indicate,
right?
okay, can you let me
So that
answer?
means it's
Can you
not
let me answer?
relevant to today's bill.
Okay, do you want to give a speech?
I'm sorry,
Okay,
go ahead.
so the issue is that indicates the problem because it justifies intervention in the overall Middle East, despite that not being who the AUMF is.
Hi, Representative. So can you tell me what situation specifically the AUMF is designed to be used for?
Even if it's just, as Mr. Josephson pointed out, even if it's just used for Al-Qaeda, the issue is that it's being used to justify intervention in the Middle East as a whole.
So
that
it's designed to be used just for terrorism. How is that relevant to trade wars and trade imbalances?
Okay, so the explanation is that when it's being used for other things that are not related to terrorism in the status quo, that proves its far-reaching ability.
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may mute themselves. Negate affirmation. Speakers, please raise your placards. Go to Mr. Ontiru. And Mr. Lin, your personal privilege is granted.
Good morning, everyone. This is Senator Ontiru, O-N-T-E-E-R-U, speaking for the first time this session on the affirmative. Just a signal when you're ready would be wonderful. Is anyone not ready? Awesome. I remember when this Congress had integrity, when we didn't write laws for primetime coverage or campaign donations, but to protect the only thing our country had left, democracy. For the past 10, 20, 30 years, we've backed down in fights against all people in all branches, not just to save face, but to save our careers. I'm done hiding. The executive branch's unchecked expansion and abuse of power isn't their fault, it's our own for not regulating them. Understand that today's legislation flips that script once and for all. First, pass this bill today because you forced the USTR to work faster when it comes to combating international threats. In the status quo, the USTR is incredibly slow between the initial submission of a claim against a foreign government and a decision of the action you are taking against it. Let's look at past precedent. According to the USTR itself, on March 12th of 2019, on the EU's blockade of US beef imports, the initial claim submission against the EU was in February 2017. It took the USTR over 2 years until December 2019 to make a final decision on tariffs. On Chinese tariffs, it took them 8 months to come up with a decision. After they made that decision, it took them another 8 months to realize it was absolutely flawed and then came up with a new one. Why is this the case? And the March 2017 confirmation hearing of Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, the head of the USTR, their investigative practices when it comes to foreign governments are incredibly ineffective and haven't been adapted for decades. The USTR has the responsibility to solve problems that require immediate, decisive actions. They let unfair policies come into the US and never change that. Today's bill flips that script. Under Section 2, you now have 45 days to render a decision on retaliatory action after submittal. The impact of this is that when foreign governments are abusing US economic policy, they don't have a year to decide, they have a month. That means you make huge change. Senator Lahiri makes the assertion that international relations will be harmed as a result of the AUMF, but remember, the AUMF is the authorized use of military force. It has nothing to do with tariffs. But continuing on, let's recognize that you close the information gap between the executive and legislative branch and actually improve Congress's foreign policy. Both Senators Lahiri and Bogan make the assumption that we destroy international relations because Congress can't make foreign policy. The reason why is because they don't have information in the first place. According to the USTR's own policies on monitoring and enforcement actions, because they're in the executive branch, they don't tell anything at all to Congress. And as a direct result, Congress has no ability to correctly legislate on foreign policy. Remember what I told to Mr. Bogan in cross-examination. Under Section 1B, for the first time in history, congressional approval is required from the onset of a potential investigation. That means that all of a sudden, the legislative branch has the propensity and capacity to make foreign policy. Today's debate isn't over the USTR, it's over the very integrity of this Congress and this nation. Stand up for what's right before nothing.
Thank you for your speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to Mr. Ma, and then we will move on to Mr. Rodriguez.
Hi, Representative, or hi, Senator. So you argue in your first contention that right now the U.S. Trade Representative takes far too long, right? So if given that the tariffs are often so abusive, why is it a good thing that we want to significantly shorten the amount of time they have to think over the tariffs?
No, you misunderstood my point. The reason they're long is because the USTR is super ineffective. By shortening their time period and increasing congressional oversight,
okay, but even if inefficiency is the reason, why is it inherently a good thing to shorten the amount of time to think over tariffs that have been so bad in the past?
Because if tariffs destroy the US economy, we need immediate action. That's what I stand for.
Okay, but what if we immediately pass? Isn't that inherently worse than the status quo?
Not at all.
Mr. Rodriguez.
I hate to be that guy, but I saw Representatives Bogan and Lahiri raise their placard, and again, I think they had less questions than me. So,
well, all of you have one question. So
I have two.
You have 2 questions?
Yeah.
That's okay. Hold on 1 second. Are you making? There's a mistake. Yeah. Okay, so that will go to Ms. Lahiri.
Hi.
Thank you. How often do trade wars escalate to military conflict?
Never.
Never. The example of Turkey probably proves that, right?
Listen,
oh, wait.
The United States isn't Turkey. In the US's context, we know enough about foreign policy to never go to military action.
Wait, we've never gone to military action after tariffing a country? We literally sanctioned Turkey and now we're in a military conflict.
Okay, I really think it's unreasonable that President Trump's going to deploy troops in China. Like that is a huge
What?
limitation.
Why is that? Wait, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, have trade wars ever escalated to military conflict?
Sure,
Because your only response to the
trade
AUMF
wars
argument is that's about military, not trade.
I really don't think that any economic issue will lead to military.
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves.
I think the chair.
Negation speakers rise. That will go to Mr. Josephson.
I thank the chair. Mr. Presiding Officer, I know you're always ready, but Judges Parley, please let me know when I'm set to begin. When it comes to trade bills, this Congress all too often focuses on the dollars while ignoring the actions that make the most sense for our constituents. So I'd like to ask everybody here in this Senate to join me in failing this bill because it eliminates our ability to effectively retaliate in times of crisis. And that's because Section 2C only allows a unilateral response if there's a declaration of war or an AUMF. So let's actually open up our history books. And let's remember that when Senator Lynn brings up World War II in his intro, in 1945, that was actually the last time this Congress declared war, 75 years ago. Senator Lahiri talks about the AUMF. Our last AUMF was passed 18 years ago in 2002. That one was on Iraq. That's expired. Our other active AUMF is against Al-Qaeda. We don't really trade with them. That's not relevant today. So let's realize that even though it's unlikely, let's remember that it's unlikely that we'll ever actually invoke the clauses in Section 2C because we don't declare war and our AUMFs aren't relevant. But this Senate is way too smart to conflate a lack of announced war with a lack of actual war. Senator Lahiri just asked Senator Ontiru about non-sanctioned military action in Turkey. We don't have an AUMF or a declaration of war there, but there still is war. Let's also realize that a 10-year government accountability report from 2006 to 2016 tells us that, in fact, the next new frontier in warfare is the cyber front. Cyber attacks from Russia and China against the federal government have gone up more than 1,300% in that 2006 to 2016 window. Cyber attacks, these aren't just anonymous ones and zeros, though, and they're also having devastating personal implications on Americans across our country. And we realized that when Russia attacked Equifax in 2017, they were able to get the names, dates of birth, and social security numbers of 145 million Americans, which directly impacts their ability to get jobs, directly impacts their vulnerability to identity theft, and all sorts of drastic financial implications. So when the affirmation comes up here and talks about trade policy and long-term foreign impact, they're not telling you what happens to the people that are happening right now. And we can't protect them under this bill because this warfare isn't being declared and it's not being fought under an AUMF. When you pass this bill, you make sure that we're powerless to fight back against the people who are attacking American citizens every day. But now I'm going to take a couple seconds and do what Senators Gee, Bogan, Khan, Lahiri, and Ontiru weren't able to do, and actually tell you what Section 301 does in the status quo. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 gives the U.S. executive branch in the status quo the authority to enforce U.S. rights under international trade agreements and respond to unfair practices not covered by them. It's the principal mechanism that the president can use to determine that a foreign country has violated trade agreements and engage in responses to those unfair reactions. So what happens when you pass this bill is you make sure that the president isn't able to effectively retaliate when our country is at risk. Just because you don't see a war doesn't mean there isn't one. So let's pass to stay safe, or let's fail to stay safe.
Thank you, Mr. Josephson, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. And Mr. Lin, your point of personal privilege is granted. That will start with Mr. Burkhart and then go to Mr. Lin.
Okay, thank you. So you're concerned about like hacking and intellectual property, correct?
Well, not just hacking. All the warfare that we're conducting today isn't covered by
Okay, but mostly
declarations
on the
or
cyber scale,
AUMFs.
correct?
I'm sorry?
Mostly things on the cyber scale, right?
Well, that's a part of it, but there's also like
okay, but doesn't the USTR issue a report every single year detailing certain countries that are a threat to like intellectual property and are a threat to our like cyber warfare?
There's a difference from being on that list and having a declaration of war or an AUMF.
Okay, but if they're on that list, won't people in the United States still have some awareness?
They'll be aware, but we won't be able to take
and then they
unilateral
take
action
actions
against
to make sure that they're not being hacked.
So let's lay a basic foundation of agreement in this debate. Is trade war bad?
Trade wars are bad. Yeah.
Yes. What are the mechanisms by which the president can wage a trade war?
Well, so the thing is, we don't wage trade wars just willy-nilly, right? Because like you said, they're dangerous and they impact.
What about
people in
tariffs, the
really-
trade war with China amidst COVID-19? What do you mean it's not willy-nilly?
Well, I'm saying that we don't go put trade wars on whoever we want. The real problem with this bill is it makes sure we can't retaliate when we
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker, please mute yourselves. Affirmation
Thank the chair.
speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Mazumdar.
I thank the chair. Oh, by the way, I think Mr. Ontiru has a point of privilege.
Mr. Ontiru, point of personal privilege.
This is a point of information. I know
Point of information.
some people who are like on different computer systems, there's a bit of a lag when it comes to timing. Would you mind doing like 10 seconds down from 3 minutes just so we can see where we are?
Absolutely. Yeah, I understand that. So, so once it gets to 3 minutes, I will count down like this. That's all good for everybody? Okay.
Hi, everyone. That's Mr. Mazumdar. At your leisure, I'll begin speaking on the affirmation. Okay. Robert Lighthizer, our current U.S. trade representative, is always looking for a fight. When he's not imposing duties on China, he runs Civil War reenactments with his family by purchasing and leasing historic battlefields to nostalgic Southern Americans. But today, I'm not looking for a fight with the negation. I'm looking for a unified solution to put the people back into the international politics, which directly affects them. Pass today's legislation. Pass to look to Section 2A of this bill, where we give Congress direct authority over this process, not just by our vote on whether or not to take retaliatory measures, but more importantly, by allowing us to determine what exclusions to the retaliatory measures we actually want. Now, we've heard Senator Rodriguez in questioning and Senator Lahiri in her speech call this a bad thing. They tell us that it would let partisan politics impede progress, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. Let's look at what happened the last time partisan foreign policy went head-to-head with local interests in this Congress. On December 19th of last year, the Washington Post reported that the USTR brought Trump's USMCA agreement before the House for approval. When it looked like it was going to pass easily, several powerful industry interests began to run local ad campaigns against Republican leadership, asking them to prioritize their district's economic interests. So Republican leadership invited the industry to Capitol Hill in an unprecedented event. The assistant professor Ian Osgood from the University of Michigan on February 11th of 2019 tells us that industry interest groups, labor unions, and the United Steelworkers were brought to the legislating table. Their interests forced congresspeople across the aisle to support more moderate versions of the trade policy. Now, I'm not naive enough to say that we will prioritize our constituents over party leadership with no incentive. But when faced with local industries, which could primary us in safe districts or support our oppositions in swing districts, we are forced to prioritize our industries and local economies over our party affiliation. When you pass, this trend will continue tenfold because we get to vote on what industries are excluded from retaliatory measures. We are forced to advocate for our local industries' interests. Because of this power, industry leaders, farmers, local economic representatives will be invited to help draft the policy, and we better invite them. They'll run our re-election campaign into the ground if we don't. Senator Lahiri, you say that Congress fears re-election, which makes us ineffective. On the contrary, our need for re-election makes us efficient and incentivizes us to listen to our constituents. That is why Congress is inherently better than the executive office in these matters. Our policy also becomes less radical. Imagine if Congress had this power during the trade war with China. According to CNBC in August of 2019, soybean exports dropped 75% since the trade war began. If our colleagues for Illinois had this legislation, they could have advocated for the soybean farmers. So, Mr. Bogan, your main problem is congressional ignorance on foreign policy and a lack of understanding. Yet I prove that we invite industry leaders to educate us. And Mr. Josephson, you question this Congress's speed of action, but when our constituents' livelihoods are on the line, you'll find that we can be pretty persuasive. Let's stop talking about the branches of our government and remember the people that we all represent collectively. Thank you.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 6 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to Ms. Pulsick and then Mr. Khan.
I thank the chair. Thanks, Representative. Great speech. So my question to you is, why would a Congress of an opposing political party to the president ever hand them a political win with a good trade deal?
Okay, our priority is not to give President Trump what he wants. Our priority is to help our constituents and win re-election.
President Trump, I'm talking about any president in the future.
Okay, well, regardless, our foreign policy focuses on domestic policy first. That's why Congress is better at dealing with these issues than the president.
But if the president wanted to pass a beneficial trade deal, why would Congress give him that
Mr.
win?
Khan.
Hi, Representative. What
Hi.
does this Congress represent more, citizens or party lines?
Citizens is what we swear on. We don't swear on our party lines.
Okay, although we say that, does that actually happen in reality?
Listen,
how many bills have we passed
I understand.
or not passed?
Say I'm a Democratic senator from New York State. If a coal plant in my state is threatening to run me out of re-election, I'm more incentivized to help out that coal plant, regardless of my party lines.
But doesn't it take longer when opposing parties because another senator
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Ms. Paltzik.
I thank the chair once again for my judges. That's Representative or Senator, I don't really know what we are, Paltzik, spelled P-A-L-T-Z-I-K. If I could get a nod or indication when you all are ready. I know the PO is ready. Great, great, great. Okay. When the founding fathers created our Constitution with a system of checks and balances in mind, they did so not only to legislate for presidents then, but for presidents now. But because this bill fails to adequately solve problems for a president who does not listen to this Congress, or a president who does, we have no choice but to fail. First, the scope of this debate thus far has been limited to the president's usage of Section 301's retaliatory measures, but understand that closing this door only opens a more dangerous one, precisely the retaliation Representative Lahiri was worried about and questioning, only directly impacting our trade with other nations without even activating an AUMF. Without being able to turn to the Trade Act of 1974, as this bill suggests, the president could gain significant powers by activating the International Emergency Powers Act of 1977, among different acts. Benjamin Coates explains for the Journal of Modern American History in July of 2018, a rogue president can do this when presented with no other option. The Supreme Court case INS versus Chadha in 1983 found that the legislative veto at issue in Congress's ability to invalidate a president's proclamation of national emergency was unconstitutional. This ruling erased any limitations on executive discretion. Overall, he concludes that the president's powers to impose economic sanctions on foreign countries under these statuses are practically unlimited. At this point, the affirmation no longer has any ground in this debate because their concerns are not limited to Section 301. So Representative Yee, understand that the trade war you spoke about in the entirety of your first point would have still happened had your legislation been in place. Now, here is why you must actively fail this bill, because it limits our ability to negotiate with other countries. Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act, which allows the U.S. to implement tariffs if a trade partner participates in unfair trade practices. However, according to a report by the Congressional Research Service, if the USTR decides to return and start a 301 investigation, it must seek and first negotiate a settlement with the foreign country concerned, either in the form of compensation or elimination of the barrier. Depending on the case, the supply chain disruption to intellectual property violations, the USTR can take between 12 to 18 months, as Representative Otero explained. However, he's concerned that that is too long. Whether I argue that that is completely necessary. The World Trade Organization reports that this long time frame is necessary to properly negotiate and avoid the retaliatory actions in the first place. The reasons countries take over a year is because they must report the scope of the damage inflicted upon the United States, compensate for that damage before retaliation efforts even begin. The time frame is important, Representative Otero. While convenience may be an issue for you, avoiding conflict through this mandatory negotiation is an issue for me. And Representative Yee, understand that this is not cateris paribus. Things will actively get worse with our foreign policy when more retaliations happen. Representatives, I would say this bill causes more problems than it solves, but it doesn't solve any problems either. For that reason, we must fail.
The speech time of 3 minutes and 10 seconds on the dot. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to Ms. Yee and then to Ms. Wadwa.
If we were the ones who needed to first mandate that the trade representative open an investigation on China, do you really think we would have made the same mistakes as someone like our president who is incredibly biased against that country?
No, because as I explained in my first point, the president doesn't even need this investigation if he really wants to declare some kind of tariff.
But the thing is, the trade war that happened with China was started by the investigation. Because Trump had this reasoning, he's the one who's able to use Section 232.
The reason the investigation was started is because President Trump was mad.
Right, exactly. But now we're the ones who are going to mandate if that investigation can't happen.
Going to do whatever.
Hi, Senator. So when we placed tariffs on China, did we commit negotiations first?
Yes, we actually did.
No, so we actually didn't have negotiations. The first step was tariffs because the USTR's first step is always tariffs.
Yeah, we did actually have negotiations before.
So again, we didn't have negotiations because the USTR is not allowed to do negotiations. Their first step is tariffs.
19 tariffs were delayed so that negotiations could occur.
Those negotiations never happened.
Questioning time has elapsed. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Ms. Barambot.
I thank the chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Senator Brambot, spelled BRAHMBHATT. Any indication when you're ready. The first long-distance trade can be traced back all the way to the Indus Valley in Pakistan around 3000 BC. Since then, we've expanded to our part of the world and created more interconnected routes than the human mind can fathom. But as we stretch our routes, we need more oversight to ensure that we don't get tangled in our ways, which is why this legislation is such an appealing option, because it allows for the extra set of eyes that we need. First, past because it's important to have legislative checks to weigh domestic implications. This is because President Trump and his USTR are one entity. He cannot possibly know the impact on every single American industry, which is why this Congress, who has committees designated for preserving each part of our economy, should conduct an initial evaluation of possible impacts. Let's use the chemical industry as an example. The Economist explains in December of 2019 that retaliatory tariffs on US chemical and plastics exported to China put nearly 55,000 jobs at risk. Members in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana bear a disproportionate brunt of China's retaliatory tariffs. Ms. Bowman of Trade Partnership Worldwide furthers that we'll see 400,000 potential net job losses if existing tariffs remain. Senator Lahiri and Palcic champion congressional backlog, but I'd argue the extensive long-term economic impacts extensively outweigh that. Having this extra check and recommendation is extremely important. Because of this tit-for-tat tariff mentality, pricing will never be as good as before the trade war. The long-term impacts on the people are devastating. They should have a say. Second, you passed to increase WTO legitimacy. This is because in the eyes of the world stage, the USTR is seen as extremely hypocritical, as they seem to push for only President Trump's agenda. They believe that although the United States is the organization's chief member, creating it in 1995, we seem to be ignoring WTO rules whenever it's convenient for us. The International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development explains in June of 2018 that following US tariffs on steel and aluminum, the EU, China, Canada, and Mexico have publicly denounced political support on grounds that the United States engages in unilateral disputes without consulting the other members who are hit hard by our actions too. The problem has become that other countries are choosing not to follow US mandates on dispute settlements for trade. So when Senator Bogan tells us that this undermines US interference of foreign negotiations, I'd flip that to the affirmation. Look, senators, we all know the implications on our states. The majority of us do not approve of President Trump's tariffs. So when we pass, we can finally have legislative governance over the matter. That not only affects the US in the geopolitical landscape, but domestically as well. Let's not get tangled in the fallacies and focus on the route ahead. Pass.
Speech time, 2 minutes and 52 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to Mr. Bogan and then to Mr. Josephson.
Hi, Senator. So how long has the WTO acted as a mediator rather than like a legislative force?
Since 1995, since it was created.
Right. So is determining the legality of tariffs a mediating force or a legislative enforcing kind of body?
Well, the WTO mediates settlement disputes between other foreign countries that have nothing to do with the United States, and that's being undermined.
If you'll answer my question, is determining the legality of tariffs mediating or enforcing?
It's both.
So
Question, Mr. Josephson.
Hey, Senator, as our roots intertwine across the world, is there conflict?
Sure.
Yeah, awesome. So is a lot of the conflict happening now, happening under a declaration of war or an AUMF?
Sure, but a lot
No,
of it is
actually,
also
it isn't,
happening
right?
because
It
other
isn't.
countries aren't listening to our mandates.
Well, no, actually, you're operating under the assumption that most conflict is happening under the war or AUMF. It's not. Our cyber wars with China, our cyber wars with Russia,
Well, if
and
you're
pretty much
referring to
every
Section
conflict we're involved
232,
on.
that's only for national emergencies. There are so many other things that fall under Section 301.
Exactly, and let's realize how we're not able to use Section 301's power to protect our
Wouldn't
people once we
wouldn't
pass this bill.
legislative oversight be a
Questioning
lot
time
better?
has elapsed.
Too ineffective.
Negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Ma.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Ma speaking for the first time this session. I'm at the leisure of all this. Let me just give me any time when you're ready. In modern terms, a Pandora's box refers to something that seems benevolent and valuable, but in reality is a curse. But we already know of the chaos that occurs just as a result of a policy. So there's absolutely no excuse for reopening the box that we already know the consequences of. And it's because this legislation threatens to let history repeat itself by starting back down the dark path of Congress reclaiming its power over protectionism that we have no choice but to negate. So first, let's understand that throughout this entire debate, the affirmation has perpetuated one major concern: the impacts of tariffs on our own constituents. So let me return back to Senator Lynn's original framework for this debate, which has yet to be acknowledged, and turn the affirmation's impacts to the side of the negation. Because previous speakers on negation have been concerned about Congress shutting out tariffs completely because of our own inherent inefficiencies. But I'm more concerned about the opposite. If the affirmation's claims are actually true, the alternative is far worse. And that's because under the status quo, Democrats have traditionally proposed protectionist policies because Trump is actually an outlier for his policy. The Republican Party is traditionally more about free trade and less protectionism. But now, because of this collision of extremism, we've seen that Democrats support protectionism, but Trump also does it because of his own ideological views. But the problem is Congress's Democrats show support for protectionist policies, that means that they're actually more likely to pass if we pass this legislation. Because Rory Murphy from the National Law Review explains on August 1st of 2019 that potential Section 301 action is not limited, and the potential use of the statute seems to be gaining popularity outside of the Trump administration's Republican Party. For example, at a recent hearing, the Democrat-controlled Ways and Means Trade Committee raised the prospect of using Section 301 to enforce the labor provisions of the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Act. So essentially what I'm arguing is that when we pass this legislation, we're not going to see a decrease in the amount of tariffs. We're not going to see restrictions. In fact, we're actually going to see at a bare minimum, it stay the same. But let's look at the impact of passing, because passing this legislation could actually have far worse consequences, because giving more power to Congress makes tariffs more likely due to log rolling and pressure from constituents that want protectionism. Because Kimberly Ann Elliott from the World Politics Review explains on July 3rd of 2018 that Congress should exercise great caution in reclaiming its power to regulate trade because of the log rolling process, whereby representatives trade their votes for tariffs based on what it means for their constituents. And the issue is, when Congress is likely to use tariffs for political gains, that's actually going to exacerbate the negative consequences of the tariffs that speakers on the affirmation continuously talk about. Because understand that when we turn diplomatically productive tariffs into political stunts, then the constituents are the ones who suffer the most. And that's why we actually saw Trump's approval ratings among steelworkers who were hurt by his tariffs increase, despite the fact that those workers were damaged by the tariffs because of his demagogic abilities. Let's understand that we can't afford to reopen the Pandora's box of legislative protectionism, and we must negate. Thank you.
Time of that speech was 3 minutes and 4 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to, give me 1 second. I'll go first to Mr. Jawar and then go to Mr. Mazumdar.
Hi, Senator. Under this legislation, who starts the process of a Section 301 investigation?
Right. So I understand that it's still going to be the executive branch who initiates the investigations. But the problem with this legislation is that we're taking a step on the path towards Congress recontrolling its
we're not.
Power
The
over
USTR
authorization.
is still starting the process. They then come to Congress. How can Congress suddenly introduce legislation for these tariffs?
Because in the status quo, Congress is not illegal for Congress to introduce
But then
legislation
your entire
over tariffs,
argument is
but they're leaving it up to the executive because of precedent.
Mr. Mazumdar.
Thank you. So you tell us that Congress won't actually decrease the number of tariffs, but do our constituents like tariffs?
Well, actually, based on Trump's history of tariffs in his
Trump is in
administration.
Congress. We can't produce the demagoguery that he does. Do our constituents like being taxed on Chinese goods?
Well, the constituents that are most affected are the ones that fall under Trump's base.
They don't like them. We need our constituents. So
we have a different base than the Trump administration.
Not necessarily. There are Republicans in Congress, and Trump is also a Republican.
But they
Questioning
support
time.
Trump.
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may mute themselves. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Jawar.
Thank you. For the judge's reference, that's Jawar. It's spelled Jhawar. If I could just get a smaller nod from y'all when you're ready. Thank you. Thank you. Are we all good over there? Okay. Oh, 1 second. Let me get my timer. In Federalist Paper number 11, Alexander Hamilton argues that an active presence in foreign trade and the enforcement of its rules are key to being a global power. He warned, however, that the second we begin making these rules with a focus on controlling the globe instead of representing our industries, we sacrifice the sanctity of our union. It is high time the United States refocuses itself. Pass this legislation. The primary reason you pass this legislation is that it checks the executive's unilateral control over America's economy. I want to distance myself from Senator Yi, Senator Lin, Senator Ontiru, and the rest of the affirmation, because I don't think you should pass this legislation just to control Trump and Lighthizer. Section 301 tariffs have always been a problem. Senator Josephson, you gave us the statutory definition. Let's talk how they're actually used. Chad Brown from the Peterson Institute for International Economics explains on August 3rd of 2017 that the unique difference between Section 301 tariffs and all others is that 1 out of every 3 Section 301 investigations is self-initiated by the executive, meaning they are started without any formal request from United States organizations. With all other trade laws, the United States self-initiates less than 1% of all investigations. Why? It's because whenever the American worker is actually being harmed, companies, unions, industries, and more all send us requests to investigate the countries at play. The only time we need to self-initiate tariffs is when the executive wants to use tariffs for political purposes and to leverage the American economy for their benefit. Why does that stop when you pass this legislation? I am disappointed that my entire side has painted the affirmative case as anti-tariffs. That is not what this legislation is about. Whether you think tariffs are good or bad, this legislation simply gives you an opportunity to express your opinion in the first place. Section 1B forces the trade representative to justify their decisions in an open congressional hearing and gives us an opportunity to vote on them. Senators Poutsick and Bogan, this legislation isn't forcing anyone to the WTO. If we need Section 301 tariffs, we can use them. Just have the USTR come here and convince me that we do. Senator Khan, Congress has 535 voices to represent over 330 million Americans. Even if they vote on party lines, it is high time that we stop letting one person call all the shots. Most importantly, this decreases trade uncertainty. Senator Bogan, you say Section 301 tariffs haven't had a large impact. Listen closely here. A September 2019 report released by the Federal Reserve finds that trade uncertainty caused by the executive's erratic policy has costed $200 billion to America's economy. That's coming right out of my constituents' paychecks. I'll protect them. I'll pass.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 10 seconds exactly. Questioners, raise your placards. That will go first to Ms. Brombot and then to Ms. Poutsick.
Senator, are you proposing that we get rid of Section 301 altogether?
No, I'm saying that every time the executive wants to use Section 301, it should go through this Congress.
Okay, but So you say that Section 301 is so problematic, but how would it be problematic if we are able to tariff these countries and actually gain revenue from it?
Section 301 is problematic because the executive can use it without any formal request, and they can simply go on their own whims and use it as a political tool. It's not
right, but that
problematic
still
when it goes
exists under this legislation, right?
It's not problematic when it goes through Congress.
Senator, great speech. So I'm still a little confused. You haven't really explained the efficacy of your side, especially if there are other options for the president to take.
Those other options are non-unique. They exist in the status quo. I would at least kick out one bad option.
Exactly, but still, in your argument, the option still exists. So how do you access your impacts?
The point of this legislation isn't to get rid of those options. It's to get rid of this problematic one.
Right, but still, there's no efficacy or impact.
It is, because it's one going away.
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Christian Rodriguez, whenever you're ready. Just give me 1 second to set up a timer, and I'm assuming the presiding officer is ready.
Always ready.
Beautiful. This country and the world as a whole was built on the idea of economic globalism and the ability to cooperate and trade with whoever you wanted. And sure, trade wars happen, tariffs and sanctions are placed, but it's a necessity to make sure global stability remains. But what we have to realize is that when we take this power, this fundamental ability to make sure the world stays stable, and we put it in the hands of a body that remains on party lines, and that is a fundamental blow to democracy, we must fail this piece of legislation. This entire debate boils down to one main clash point. Who is better in determining trade policy, the United States Trade Representative or the United States Congress? This essentially goes back and forth between the affirmative and the negative, telling you one is better than the other. I will definitively tell you right here, right now, Congress is way worse than the USTR in determining trade policy for 3 key reasons. First, it's been mentioned multiple times about party lines and how Congress only votes on them, with representatives such as Mr. Bogan referencing this. Let's see how bad the actual problem is. A study by Logan Dancy from the University of Utah found on July 24th of 2017 that in the past decade, Congress has voted on party lines 90% of the time. Anyone who comes up here and tells you that because it's trade policy and we're looking out for the best needs of our constituents, it's going to change, that's blatantly untrue. On issues such as healthcare, immigration, and everything else, this Congress continues to vote on whether or not you're Democrat or Republican, rather than whether or not it's good for the people. So Representative Ontario, I agree, giving information to Congress is objectively good, but no matter how much information we give, this doesn't change. And Representative Mazumdar, we should be looking out for the rights of the constituents and what they want. This bill does not ensure that. Second, even if you don't believe that, look to Ms. Lahiri's argument earlier in this round, where she explains that Congress is inherently anti-tariff because tariffs are just a very risky trade policy to pass in the first place. And I agree with Representative Jawar's framework. This bill shouldn't be about being anti-tariff, but the problem, Mr. Jawar, is that's inherently what this is. On issues such as tariffs against China and Mexico, both sides were against it. Why? Because tariffs are just a risky policy. No matter if they're good or bad, it's always going to bite them in the back at the end of the day. Third, on top of all of this, the USTR is by far the best body when it comes to handling trade negotiations and trade policies by themselves. Look to the office of the USTR themselves to explain on February 25th of 2020 that they themselves were the ones who negotiated with China for months and months, both before and after we placed tariffs. But they know much more about Congress when it comes to trade negotiations. And no matter how much they brief us on it, we will never truly understand as much as they know. Make sure they're the ones deciding policy, not Congress. And lastly, I want to point out something very important. Notice how every single affirmative senator has only listed the Trump administration as something bad with tariffs. Why are we going to set a permanent precedent over one administration? Fail this bill.
Speech time 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. We will start with, give me 1 second, I'll look over. We'll start with Mr. Lin and go to Mr. Ontiru.
Hi, Mr.
Great.
Lin.
Hello. So can you explain to me why tariffs are a bad policy?
They're not inherently a bad policy. I'd argue there are some situations that are good, some situations are bad. My problem is I think Congress can't differentiate.
But you said in your speech, tariffs are a bad policy. Could you explain why?
No, I didn't mean that. What I said was that Congress is inherently anti-tariff, and this legislation shouldn't be that way.
Okay. And you said Congress is more likely to vote over party lines, fluctuate.
Yeah, so the problem is in issues in the past and issues right now, they're always going to vote for party lines.
Mr. Ontiru.
What does line 13 of this bill say?
Let me pull it up for you really quickly.
I'll tell you. The USTR will render the decision within 45 days. Not Congress. The USTR makes the final decision.
Overall, we still have to pass legislation under this bill.
I mean, yes, but your entire argument is predicated on the fact that Congress is ineffective. We don't have the option. We can either approve or deny.
But the problem is this bill says that if tariffs are to continue, this Congress has to pass them.
Yes.
That's inherently problematic.
They make the decision.
Questioning time has elapsed. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. We'll go to Ms. Wadwa.
I thank the chair. If I could get a thumbs up from the judges when they're ready, that'd be great. Thank you. Are we ready? Okay. As we come to the end of today's debate, it seems like arguments on both the affirmation and the negation have become a little clouded. So allow me to break through the fog and explain exactly why the affirmation wins today's debate. And that's because first, the USTR is inherently ineffective. Now, allow me to clear up one of the biggest misconceptions on the negative, and that's when Senator Bogan and Senator Palcic claim that the first step of the USTR is negotiations. Unfortunately, that's false, because as the Congressional Research Service finds, the USTR must give preference to tariffs if other countries violate any terms agreed to in a Section 301 agreement, such as the issue of state subsidies and exchange rates. Essentially, the USTR is obligated to prefer tariffs over negotiation, and the effects of this can be seen in the United States trade war. The Heritage Foundation states on April 5th that the United States has placed tariffs on over $250 billion worth of imports from China. And even though China has failed to take any substantive actions to address United States concerns, we haven't found an alternative solution. And that's the exact problem. Even though these tariffs have failed, we're not looking at alternative options because quite literally, we can't. Senator Lahiri, Bogan, Ma, and Rodriguez all claim that Congress refuses to pass effective foreign policy, and I'm in no position to negate that. But what you need to understand is we are still better than the status quo, where the USTR pushes us into a corner when it comes to foreign policy, saying that the first step always has to be tariffs. Again, it's not about if tariffs are good or bad. It's about making sure that we have the option to pursue negotiations. We have the option to pursue other possible methods. Right now, we need to understand that United States foreign policy is very precarious. Every foreign relationship is unique, and they cannot be solved by a simple solution of blanket tariffs. But further, the impacts of this problem bleed into the domestic sphere. And that comes back to Senator Lynn's original argument that this legislation will help us solve the lack of access to medical supplies. That's the biggest impact in today's debate, because despite emergency circumstances under COVID-19, the federal government is still rejecting tariff exemptions for critical medical supplies. And that's a problem because of the USTR. Eric Bowen finds on March 27, 2020, that the process for gaining an exemption from Trump's anti-China tariffs is a complex, opaque process with no due process for businesses whose requests are denied. The system gives the executive branch unilateral authority to determine what products get taxed and which do not. And the USTR does not have enough resources to make it effective because during the government shutdown, the USTR furloughed 75% of its workforce. Since then, they've only gained back 30%. Senator Josephson, I agree. We need to worry about the American people, and for their safety, we affirm.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go to, we'll start with Mr. Ma and move on to Mr. Rodriguez.
Hi, Senator. So you argue that one of the major problems with current trade is that tariffs happen before negotiations. So how exactly does this legislation change that?
What happens now is that Congress has the power to decide exactly what we do. So we don't have to
Wait.
follow the strict
Congress has the power to
regulations
decide
that
exactly what we
USTR
do, or they have a problem. They have the power to authorize the USTR's
So
action.
yeah, so USTR has the final say, but Congress
Right.
can now
So how do we
pursue
change like
negotiations
the
before
order
tariffs.
of what the
We don't
USTR
have
is
that
allowed to?
regulation anymore.
How do we change the order of like what the USTR is allowed to engage in?
Because with
Rodriguez.
Congress, we have the power to change that.
Hi, so I agree with you. The USTR is inherently flawed in certain ways, but if the USTR is the one who specializes in these negotiations and in trade as a whole, why should we be taking power away from them and giving it to Congress?
Because, Senator, at the end of the day, Congress is still a bipartisan organization and we have multiple voices, whereas the USTR is essentially one person, maybe two, deciding
But
everything.
if Congress
and that's not a fair
specializes in many
process.
things and the USTR only specializes in trade, isn't it inherently better to
Questioning
give them
time has elapsed.
Personal privilege.
Point of personal privilege, Mr. Bogan? Granted. Seeing as that was a affirmation, negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Khan.
I thank the chair. Any indication of when my judges are ready would be great.
Mr. Rodriguez, do you have a point?
Point of personal privilege to exit chamber.
Granted.
Thank you.
Do I have all my judges ready? Yep. All right. Growing up, my mom used to tell me, you can do anything if you put your mind to it. And I believed her. But then I became a member of this Congress and realized that no matter what I put my mind to, the inherent function of this body makes it really difficult to achieve anything. So to imagine that we're going to hold another agency accountable when we can barely keep ourselves accountable is quite frankly impossible. Negate. Let's start off with today's debate with an observation. Realize that the US Trade Representative would want to do everything they can to keep their power, whether this Congress takes it away or not. And this is crucial to understand, because as simple as it may be, that means if there are clear loopholes in today's bill, the USTR will do everything in their power to exercise them. And as it turns out, this bill does have a clear loophole outlined in Section 2B that every single speaker has ignored, even the sponsor. If you read the section, it says that the USTR would be allowed to add HTS codes and remove them by request. But you're probably thinking, what's an HTS code? These are specific trade guidelines for products themselves, meaning today's legislation allows the USTR to put tariffs on certain products to the level that they desire. That's where you see the problem start to be created. The USTR's website themselves explains that more than 98% of the merchandise in international trade is classified in terms of the HTS. The USTR clearly has power to increase these tariffs at will. But now, when you can increase tariffs on a certain product, you can try to exploit which countries have a monopoly or a dominant in the market on certain products and increase the tariffs on those products. You see that when you allow this loophole to happen, the USTR would increase their products on different countries. And now, since some countries get to have get tariffs applied to them, you actually see a net harm, because increasing tariffs on certain goods could be destructive to other countries. But now, since we have a reason that passing this bill could actually leave us worse off, let's compare this to why each of the affirmative speakers thinks their world is preferable. Start off with Representative Yi. She explains that trade wars could create devastating impacts, but now you can tie that to the negative impact of having destructive tariffs across each and every country when the USTR will increase its tariffs on certain products. Then you can look to Representative Lin, who says we need ventilators that China has with the coronavirus, but has already answered during questioning, current retaliatory tariffs don't get removed under today's legislation. You see no short-term solvency. Then Representative Antiro and Mazumdar explained that the USTR is really slow, but quite frankly, this Congress isn't any better. Look at Brookings in 2019, who explains, historically, this Congress is easily arguably the least efficient branch of the government. And quite frankly, that makes sense because bipartisanship and the fact that we have so many votes, we have our advantages, I'll admit that, but not in making tariff policy. Lastly, look to Representative Broombart, who makes the last unique argument on the affirmation, who says the World Trade Organization acts as a mediator. As Representative Bogan already said, they determine the legality of tariffs only. You see that all lends lead to the USTR increasing its tariffs.
Thank you, Mr. Khan, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will first go to Mr. Burkhart, and then we will follow up with, give me 1 second, Mr. Lin.
Okay, so section 2B continues. What does it say at the end? That was like, what's the last sentence of section 2B?
I don't memorize the bill, but what
it says that Congress has to provide the funding for the mandate, right? Let's say the USTR wants to change this. Can't we as Congress just not give them the funding so they can't change the schedule?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Okay, if we have to provide the funding for them to change the schedules, let's say they want to do it. Can't we as Congress, if we're authorized under today's piece of legislation?
Congress can't reject that funding. It just says Congress has to provide the funding that the USTR makes the decision.
Okay, but can't we just reject the funding if they have to get that funding from us?
So you talked about how the USTR would be unaccountable under Congress. Is the USTR accountable now?
No, that's not really what my argument is. My argument is that the USTR's power gets worse because right now they're going to, like, my observation is they're going to do everything they can to try to increase their power. They want to keep their power, right? So right now you can make tariffs under certain
if Congress
products,
check them well, would they be a check?
Huh?
Would Congress be a check?
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may mute themselves and remain seated. Your point of personal privilege is granted, Ms. Wadwa. And seeing as that was a negation speech, affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. I'll go to Mr. Burkhart.
Thanks. That's Senator Burkhart speaking for the first time today. Any indication? I think I can see you all, so thumbs up anything. I'm just gonna pin you quick. Perfect. I'll begin. My favorite pop singer, Carly Rae Jepsen's masterpiece Emotion, contains a song, I didn't just come here to dance. And I didn't just come here to dance around an important question in today's debate. So let's examine two important questions, ask ourselves these, and understand why they flow to the side of the affirmation. Now, I'd like to examine this under Senator Jawar's framework, that we're not necessarily anti-tariffs when it comes to today's piece of legislation. So thus, we need to ask ourselves two important questions. Which side reduces unilateral action, and which side promotes the most effective use of tariffs? And understand when we ask those questions, it flows to the side of the affirmation. Now first, which side reduces unilateral action? Now first, pass today's piece of legislation ultimately because it will increase the legitimacy of the World Trade Organization, thus reducing the need for tariffs in the first place. As Representative Brahmov told us in her speech, that we're going to increase legitimacy of the World Trade Organization, but she never gave you a warrant as to why. And it's ultimately true because the US's unilateralism has ultimately blocked any resolutions from happening in the World Trade Organization. See, there's an appellate body when it comes to resolving trade disputes. But the United States, in its unilateralism, as Philip Blankenship writes for Reuters on December 10th of 2019, has blocked all appointments to this appellate body, meaning trade disputes, before they come to tariffs, can actually go to this appellate body. But because of the United States' unilateralism, this appellate body has no jurisdiction to resolve these trade disputes before we go into sanctions in the first place. So by promoting multilateralism, we're ultimately going to see the World Trade Organization is strengthened, and thus we won't have to even turn to sanctions. But let's say we do turn to sanctions. Representative Potsky tells us that there are ultimately alternatives that when we pass today's piece of legislation will rise. The only alternative provided was Representative Bogan when he tells us that Section 232 tariffs will ultimately increase. But understand that's ultimately preferable because when Section 232 tariffs increase, ultimately we see greater accountability because ultimately the Department of Commerce is in charge. As the Congressional Research Service tells us in April 6th of 2020, the Article 232 decisions for sanctions are ultimately overlooked by the courts first and foremost. They've established precedent that the courts can overlook these, but ultimately understand that the Commerce Department's funding was slashed by 37%. So even if they do want to implement these sanctions, it's likely going to be unenforceable because the Department of Commerce's funding is so low. But second, which side promotes the most effective use of tariffs? Representatives have told us that politics are ultimately going to inhibit any effective use of tariffs. Or this was first brought up by Representative Lahiri and then Representative Ma. But ultimately, this was answered by Representative Antiro, first because they get better knowledge. Then Representative Mazudar tells us that we're going to promote the use or the labor unions voice in this. Ultimately, I'm going to say that the labor unions and the people that are elected are ultimately going to have a better say than fellow representatives in the log rolling argument that Representative Ma brings up. And finally, on the idea of a swift response. Ultimately, Representative Ontiru tells you that we're promoting better knowledge within Congress, and the USTR does not necessarily inhibit an upstate piece of legislation. See, Representative Josephson, once a swift response, we're still giving the USTR a swift response, but we're just mandating congressional approval. Representatives, don't let the negation's emotion cloud your greater judgment in today's debate. Affirm for the betterment of the United States in the world.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to Ms. Lahiri and then go to Mr. Bogan.
Thank you. Great speech. The bill stops blanket tariffs, right? That the USTR issues.
Could you repeat that?
The bill stops the USTR from issuing blanket tariffs.
Sure, the unilateral action of tariff.
Okay, so Mr. Khan says the USTR can just decide which products to tariff. How does that curb unilateral action?
Okay, because I told you that in his questioning, when he brought up the idea that the USTR can just do whatever it wants because of that the Congress ultimately has to provide the funding for that mandate. So if the USTR wants to do it, we
Wait,
can
but
just
that's the
say,
status
Mr.
quo.
Bogan.
Congress.
So do you think that President Trump's tariffs against China were unjustified under 232? Because it was not a matter of national security, right?
Perhaps they were unjustified, yeah, because it wasn't a matter of national
so
security.
What did the Supreme Court do in response?
Pardon?
What did the Supreme Court do in response?
Well, the Supreme Court has ruled on 232 that ultimately they can overlook these 232 tariffs and ultimately rule on it. But the Supreme Court didn't necessarily rule on 232. It's just the deadline expired on 232.
I hear the challenge against Trump's tariffs, and a federal court actually upheld his steel tariffs. How is
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may mute themselves. Mr. Rodriguez, do you have a motion?
Point of personal privilege to re-enter the chamber.
Granted. And Ms. Wadwa, you may also re-enter the chamber as I'm looking through the chat. Anyways, negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Ms. Velunsky.
Thank you. This is Representative Velunsky speaking for the first time this session. I can't see the judges from my Zoom right now, so if the PO could let me know when they're ready, please.
Okay, just judges, just hold up the thumbs up and I'll let her know. Judge ready, judge ready. Is there anyone not ready? Okay, then I'm going to assume everyone's ready.
Great.
The floor is
Thank
yours.
you. In Washington's farewell address, he warned the American people of the dangers of foreign powers. He said, "We have independence left to seek." And today, that still holds true, because 300 years later, we still haven't listened. So let's finally learn from history and negate, because firstly, understand that congressional members are more susceptible to lobbying. Bringing trade powers to Congress means more opportunities to get lobbied, since the nations that trade with the US have clear incentives to do so, namely that the American market is very big and tariffs can be very large. According to US News in August 17th of 2018, foreign governments spend millions lobbying for more favorable trade policy. For example, Japan, a US ally, lobbies through the Japan External Trade Organization, spending over $6 million. So Representative Jawar, we're not going to get more representation from Congress. We'll get more corporation-centric trade policy. And that's because focusing on producers and firms over consumers negates the purposes of free trade. This influences two types of tariffs. First, we're less likely to remove tariffs that are protectionist. This harms the US in the long run because you are propping up firms that lack a competitive advantage. The money, workers, and limited resources could have gone to something more productive. And second, lobbying increases the chance of retaliatory tariffs, like we saw in trade wars with China and India over the last 2 years, as nations who do not receive favorable trade deals respond in kind, polarizing our trade relationships between those who lobby and get good trade and those who don't and get bad trade. The polarity of partners harms America's ability to negotiate because we become connected to fewer trading partners. That creates higher prices and worse political and economic relations. Now, secondly, let's clear up the misconceptions of the affirmation once and for all. Senator Yee said that giving the president unilateral control of trade results in worse policies. And Senators Ontiru and Brombaugh talked about how tariffs in the past have hurt our economy. But we're only going to see policies from Congress that benefit businesses, not constituents. And that's the last thing we need. This isn't the first time Congress has bent to private interests, and it won't be the last. Senator Mazumdar brought up the example of how private industries influence the USMCA and how that was actually a good thing because it represented local interests. Now, that may have been an example where private interests prevailed, but in the vast majority of cases, we cave to the big companies that don't have our constituents' interests at heart. And that's exactly what's going to happen to our trade policies if we pass this bill. So, Senator Wadhwa, while the first step of the USTR may be tariffs, Congress is inherently worse at passing fair trade policies. Finally, Senator Lynn said this helps with the free flow of goods, which we desperately need in the time of the coronavirus pandemic. But by maintaining protectionist tariffs, as Congress is known to do, we reduce the flow of goods into our country, which harms our constituents. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And clearly, the affirmation hasn't learned.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 6 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to Ms. Yee, and then finally go to Ms. Brombach.
If you're arguing that lobbying leads to more voting along party lines, who's more likely to vote based on party lines, us or the president and his chosen trade representative?
So I didn't say voting against party lines. I said voting in the favor of private interest. And that's what's going to happen because these
Do you
countries
think Trump
and
is
private
more
interests
interested
have
in
a huge
protecting
incentive to
his
lobby.
hotel chain or coal farmers in New York?
I would say his hotel chain because that's what we've seen from him in the past.
So he's more biased to protect his private interests, whereas we all have different interests.
But
and
that
bring
doesn't
different
mean that Congress
perspectives.
doesn't want to also protect private interests. It's
sorry?
not specific to
Ms.
the president.
Brombach.
Why is it inherently bad that a business is telling its representative that as a result of tariffs, they could go bankrupt?
Because Congress is representative of the people, not of the businesses.
Right, the people own businesses, right? Small businesses.
I'm
right?
not talking about small businesses. I'm talking about huge corporations and
There are
other countries
impacts
that
on
lobby
small
Congress
businesses because
for
of
better
tariffs,
trade
correct?
policies. That may
There
have
are
been one
impacts on
example.
small businesses due to tariffs, correct?
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Mr. Bogan, do you have a motion?
I move to the previous question.
Is there a second? Just raise your placards. Is there anybody opposed? Okay, it does not look like there's anybody opposed, so we will unilaterally move to the previous question. All who wish to pass the Trade Act, please raise your placards. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All who wish to fail. All right, any abstentions? There should be none. On a vote of 7 to 8, I believe I might have miscounted. Hold on one second. How many people are in this chamber aside from me?
16.
16. Okay. So on a vote from, I think there might have been lag when I was counting because I got a vote of 7 to 8.
You missed an AF vote.
I missed
Should
an
be
AF
8
vote.
to 8.
Okay, my apologies. There's a little bit of lag whenever I'm counting votes. So if I miss somebody's placard and I say the wrong ratio of passes to fails, just let me know. Anyways, that's a vote to 8 to 8, which means that the PO must decide. The negation has convinced me to fail this legislation. So my apologies to Ms. Yee, the sponsor of this legislation, but this legislation does fail anyway, seeing as that we are finished that legislation. Mr. Ontario, do you have a motion?
I move for a 5-minute recess, seeing national debate.
Is there a second?
Second.
Anyone opposed? All right, let's move to a 5-minute recess. Be back by 12:40. Okay, everybody, it is 12:40, so start making your way back to your computer so that we can begin debate on a legislation about protecting Americans over large organizations. I'll make sure that everybody's back before we begin.
And while people are coming back, just a reminder that we should not have any observers in chamber. We have a YouTube stream going. It's going very well. So make sure that that's where you are so that the chamber can participate without excessive lag. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, do we have everybody back? I think we still have one judge missing. I'll give it some time. Okay, we're still waiting on the last judge, right? Yes? Okay. Okay, do we have all of our judges back? Yes? Okay, let's start debate on a legislation about large organizations and protecting Americans. Sponsorships, please rise. Raise your placards. That will go to Mr. Josephson.
Thank the chair. Everybody, this is Senator Josephson, my second time, hopefully not last time, speaking this session. Pio, I know you're always ready. Judges Parley, I'll begin in a moment. We started today's session with a moment of silence for all of those that have been affected by this pandemic. But silence can only do so much, which is why we need today's bill to take action in order to bring justice and integrity back to the people that this pandemic has hurt. So let's do this. Let's pass this bill in order to protect the hundreds of millions of Americans whose jobs are in jeopardy and the 22 million who've already lost theirs. After all, since March 14th, we've had 22 million Americans get laid off, and we've got so many more that are at risk of more layoffs and additional pay cuts. Even when there was no pandemic, America was a terrible place to be jobless. According to a study by the Urban Institute that was published on March 4th, 2020, 44% of hourly wage workers could barely afford necessities like food and rent and clothes. But now that millions of Americans have laid off, the laws of supply and demand tell us that the already meager job openings are even harder to get. And just like USA Today reported, ironically, yesterday, unskilled laborers are finding it almost impossible to get jobs in this economy, and that it's nearly impossible for them to earn enough money to keep themselves alive. They can't afford necessities like toilet paper and actual necessities like food and water. Stimulus checks are helping, but they're nowhere near enough to make up for the money that's lost. Luckily, thanks to the stipulations in Section 2 of my bill, we can protect the wage workers that are the backbone of our economy. As the Brookings Institute tells us on May 28th of 2019, almost 46% of America comes from businesses, or rather about 46% of private equity of private business is responsible for almost 70% of our jobs. So that means that when we're able to target these corporations, we're able to have much larger effects. Because just like Section 2A tells us, we can stem the flow of unemployment by requiring that the relief we give with the CARES Act is used to maintain current employment levels. It doesn't take a degree in economics to realize that when we keep the unemployment rate from rising, we can make sure that there's less competition for jobs, and we can make sure that our economy starts back up sooner. But we also protect these Americans whose jobs are in jeopardy by making sure that they're able to keep their jobs and avoid the unemployment lines. But Section 2B then goes on to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which makes sure that the people who are already finding it nearly impossible to pay for necessities are then able to go and make a living and stay afloat. Nearly 53 million Americans, according to a Brookings Institute study in February 2019, before the pandemic, worked in low-wage jobs. And now that we find even more Americans working no jobs at all, it's essential that everybody in this chamber takes a moment of silence to listen to our constituents as they scream at us to pass.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. We will start with Ms. Veljunski, and then move to Mr. Khan, then move to Mr. Mazumdar, and then finally go to Ms. Yi.
Hi, Representative. So why do companies lay off workers?
Well, it comes down to money, right? But luckily.
Right, exactly. So can companies afford to keep their current employment levels during an economic recession?
Well, you see, that's the genius of our bailout, right? We gave about $1 trillion to different companies so that they could afford to stay afloat.
Can they maintain increasing minimum wage, supporting their current staff, and keeping everyone at the same wages?
Yes.
How do you know that? We're in an economic recession right now.
Yeah, well, I've only got 1 second, but there have been plenty of studies that show that.
Mr. Khan.
I think you're muted, Senator.
Yep. Hi, Senator. So just a few weeks ago, we passed a stimulus bill, the CARES Act, right? So what does this bill do different from that CARES Act? Because as far as I can tell, it seems like there's a lot of overlap.
So first of all, just because there's a little bit of overlap isn't an inherent problem with my bill. My bill makes sure that we can protect the jobs of people who work at businesses.
So what sections in specific are different?
So first of all, this bill makes sure that the current payroll levels and headcount levels aren't changed. I'm assuming you're saying that my bill is non-unique.
2A, that's the only difference?
I believe I called on Mr. Mazumdar next.
Hi, Senator. So like me, you want to help people with low-wage jobs, correct?
I hope everybody wants to do that.
Great. So what kind of companies does this legislation actually target?
This legislation targets the biggest companies who happen to be some of the largest employers in the nation.
Corporations. What is the likelihood that the top 10% richest companies are going to have people with low wages?
So the thing is, it's actually huge corporations like McDonald's, like airlines, like cruise ships, and the transportation industry are some of the biggest employers of low-wage workers.
How do you know about the effect of the stimulus checks if they were literally just sent out like last week?
Well, if you do a little bit of math, you can realize that the amount of money someone earns from a month of minimum wage is basically not enough for them to survive. And so when you give them $1,200 to survive from
$15, will we see extreme layoffs? Will we see people see their minimum wage go from $7.55 down to $0?
Well, the thing is actually that by giving people more money in wages, they have more money to spend.
But then
Questioning time has elapsed. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. That will go to Ms. Brombaugh.
I thank the chair. Hi, everyone. That's Senator Brombaugh speaking for the second time today. Any indication when you're ready? The Industrial Revolution should invoke images of miners emerging from mine shafts with the black rock that fueled the change from sleepy farm towns to booming industrial super hubs. That was back in 1760. 260 years later, we still have a place for exploitative labor measures in every corporate regulation that we pass. I stand on the negation because I stand for workers' rights. Let's close loopholes, not create them. First, You fail because we'll see more large private corporations filing for federal loans. This is because under Section 2A, we are essentially putting a target on large corporations to change their labor laws to $15 an hour. This is more than what the majority of small businesses usually pay their workers. This legislation essentially incentivizes workers to leave their small businesses to work at a large company. This is problematic because to accommodate for the influx of workers, this legislation allows Fortune 500 companies to get more loans from this Congress. Let's look towards the New York Times in 2008 when they explained the $700 billion Wall Street bailout was largely necessitated due to congressional regulation for these big businesses. So now, one of two things could happen. Either we see corporations turn to automation to curb these laws altogether, or we see businesses way below the 250 million threshold go under, and large corporations getting too many workers to accommodate, giving them enough grounds to file for federal loans. Either way, people lose their jobs. Second, you fail because we take away essential dollars from minimum wage paychecks. This is because if you look towards Section 2E of this bill, it mandates that its employees be part of a stock plan, effectively taking away its non-mandatory status in the status quo. Let's look to a company that's doing this right now. Bloomberg exemplifies in December of 2018 when Amazon praised minimum wage increase to $15, but then forced its employees to take $2 out of their own salaries to pay for stock plans. So if a single parent is working 10 hours, 6 days a week at a Fortune 500 warehouse, they would essentially lose well over $500 monthly. Senators, $500 is the difference between getting food, shelter, or water for millions of Americans living below the poverty line. We are essentially giving companies another bailout here, allowing them to expand their stock plan and curb these minimum wage laws. Main Street takes the fall and Wall Street gets the check. It's been the American narrative for decades, but we have the power to change that when we stop creating legislation with corporate loopholes, which is why it is essential that you fail.
Speech time is 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. That will go first to, give me 1 second. I just want to make sure everything is accurate. That starts with Mr. Josephson, goes to Mr. Jawar, then Mr. Ma, and then Mr. Bogan.
Hey, Senator, let's talk about those Amazon warehouse employees. What's 15 minus 2?
13.
Okay, what's larger, 13 or 725?
Well, Amazon and most Fortune 500 companies already have increased minimum wage laws, not $7.50.
Yeah, awesome. So do you know how much Amazon pays its employees now?
15.
Okay, great. So let's talk about what happens when we increase the minimum wage for everybody and make sure that everybody's able to earn more, pump more money back into the economy.
Every Fortune 500 company making above 250 million, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And how many people
Mr.
do they
Jawar.
employ?
Hi, Senator. You said that you stand for workers' rights, right?
Right.
So why are these workers going to be leaving the small companies and going to bigger ones?
Because their minimum wage is going to be higher.
Okay, so if we stand for workers' rights, why is it a bad thing that they go to companies where they get paid more?
Because these companies will essentially allow this influx of workers to get loans from Congress that won't go to these.
But that's a good thing. That means more people are being hired and Congress is
It's
funding
about the
companies that
stock plan
hire
as
people.
well. They won't
Mr.
even be
Ma.
getting $15.
All right, so let's follow that chain of logic. You said that it's bad that companies are going to get more loans because they're going to turn towards automation, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Because I remember hearing that in your speech. So, but in order to turn towards automation, they would have to lay off workers, right?
Correct. That's one alternative. The
But
other alternative
how does this
is
bill
that
allow
they get
that?
loans from the federal government.
Right. If
Sorry?
they're getting loans, they're applied to regulations under this legislation. But under this legislation, they can't lay off employees. So how does automation happen?
Right. So the influx of workers coming.
Senator,
Mr.
so
Bogan.
are stock-based plans considered compensation or a wage?
They're considered, they take away from somebody's wage.
Well, that's only if the employee agrees, but in general, they're considered
No,
compensation.
this legislation makes it mandatory. Under the status quo, it's not, it's optional.
I'm telling you that in general, stock-based pay is normally compensation, not part of the salary.
It is part of the salary. I told you, we're taking away right now.
Questioning
$2
time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. On recency, that will go to Mr. Jawar.
Thank you. For the judge's reference, that's Senator Jawar. It's spelled Jhawar. If I could just get a smaller nod from y'all when you're ready. Thank you. Awesome. Is anyone not ready? Okay, we can get started then. At a time when COVID-19 has ravaged our economy and hundreds of thousands of Americans have lost their jobs, I hardly think companies who log revenues above $250 million every year can say they're the worst affected. Yet they seem to be eligible for the most money. Join me on the affirmation and make sure it's being used in the right way. The primary reason you affirm this legislation is that companies historically use loans and cash infusions to boost themselves at the expense of their employees. William Lazonick, professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, writes on January 7th of 2020 that in both 2016 and 2017, almost 30% of company buybacks, when companies repurchased their own stocks, were done using borrowed money, exactly what they'd been receiving from the Federal Reserve under our recent CARES Act. Now, Senator Veliunsky, you asked how we know companies can afford giving money to workers. Listen to this. In 2018, S&P 500 companies spent on average 109% of their net income on buybacks and stock dividends. The least I can do is make sure they don't do it on the American dollar. Section 2C of this legislation bans buybacks for any company taking our loans, and Section 2F limits dividends until the company can actually afford them. This severely limits both initiatives. But why are these self-investments so problematic? First, and most importantly, they come at the expense of employees. Now, Senator Brombaugh, you're worried about us forcing employees into a stock plan, but that's not how stock plans work at all. When we present a stock plan, the employee has an opportunity to buy into a reserve set of stock for them. If they don't want to, that's absolutely fine. They keep their current wage. Irene Tong from the National Employment Law Project furthers on July 31st of 2018 that the money dedicated towards buybacks and dividends benefits rich shareholders while harming the workers who built the company. At the very least, Section 2B of this legislation mandates that workers make at least $15 an hour, a guaranteed benefit where you take money from the rich executives and put it in the hands of the workers. But even more so, if even some more money was put towards workers, imagine what would happen. If McDonald's redirected just half of buybacks, it could give every worker a $2,000 raise. If Starbucks did half, it could offer $3,500. If Lowe's, CVS, or Home Depot did half, they could all offer at least $9,000 to their workers that are suffering right now. If this Congress stopped legislating like we're the primary shareholders in these companies and started representing the millions of workers that trusted us with this office, every single American could get a raise. It starts with passing this legislation.
Speech time 2 minutes and 58 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. We will start with Ms. Wadha and go to Ms. Rombat.
Hi, Senator. So how much does this legislation say executives can make their salaries out to?
I believe it's 100 times the median salary.
Okay, and so if the median salary is $15 per hour, exactly how much does that mean that an executive salary can be?
The median salary probably wouldn't be $15
It would probably be higher, but let's take the minimum at 15. How much would the salary be?
100 times 15.
Per hour. That comes out to $3 million per year.
Yeah, the funny thing is, it's even
that higher than the current executive salary?
Hi, Senator. What does Section 2E of this legislation state?
Section 2E of this legislation says they must be part of a stock plan.
Must be part of a stock plan, which means that they have to opt into it. It's not optional. Right?
No, it means that they have to have the opportunity. They can opt in if they want. They must be part of the plan, which means
every company above $250 million, that threshold, has the opportunity for an employee to invest, right?
Yes, that's this time.
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may mute themselves. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Okay, on recency, that will go to Ms. Yee.
thank the chair. For the judges and my parley, I'm Representative Yi, spelled Y-E, as always at your leisure. And I know PO is good.
Always.
My two judges. And parley. Okay. The most iconic foods that Americans enjoy eating are burgers, deep dish pizzas, and clam chowder. But this Congress seems to only enjoy dining at a table of idealism. While many of our American constituents can't even put food on the table even after we give them this false hope. You'll have to stand with me and fail. First, fail today's legislation because it provides loopholes for companies to maintain the unequal wage gap. When representatives on the affirmation tell you that today's legislation is going to close those gaps and solve for the growing number of those falling into poverty, they fail to closely read the legislation. When a company thinks its stock is undervalued, the CEO sometimes uses their extra cash and has a few options when investing in their business. They can either pay dividends to the shareholders or buy back company shares. They buy back stocks because the tax rate is lower than the dividends. Section 2C only limits the value of stock options that can be distributed to individuals who make the most in a company. But companies can easily get around this by using something called restricted shares. These are forms of equity compensation that actually vary from stock options quite a bit. Evan Tarver of Investopedia tells us in May of 2019, restricted shares are awarded outright, and the owners of these shares have the same rights and privileges as any shareholder. However, stock options are legally different, as options are the right to buy a certain number of shares in the company at a specified price in the future. Passing stops companies from maintaining competitiveness because they'll only look towards using their restricted shares when we pass, because that's the only way they'll continue to earn the same profit. Impacts on the negative that come up with Section 2C all fail. But next, let's look at the main arguments on the affirmation that have been brought up so far. Representative Josephson tells you about the 22 million who have already been laid off. But when you pass, you give them false hope that tells them their company will finally function fairly and in their favor. The unemployment rate rises when you pass, however, because companies are now mandated to pay all employees $15 an hour. People who find it difficult to pay for necessities that you talk about will now find it impossible because they'll be laid off. Alexa Campbell of Vox tells us in July of 2019, a $15 minimum wage would lift 1.3 million out of poverty, but it would cost 1.3 million jobs too. You effectively throw those who in my state currently make the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour into a world where their income is now literally zero. Representative Jawar, you talk about stock buybacks and dividends in your entire first point, but based off the studies that I've told you, companies can easily avoid those mandates through loopholes in our legislation. In the affirmation world, all you get is a lack of competitiveness and false hope to our constituents. The affirmation continues to count down the seconds until a table leg breaks while they dine at the table of idealism. Realize at the end of today's debate, only the negation stands when you weigh the impacts. Negate.
Speech time 3 minutes and 4 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. Okay, we're going to be starting with, give me 1 second. I want to make sure that everything is accurate. Going to start with Mr. Rodriguez and then go to Mr. Lin.
Hi, so your problem with the minimum wage is that right now you're saying it's going to be bad for America because it's going to cause job loss and all of that, right?
Correct.
If these are big companies that are now being stipulated, they can't cut jobs, how exactly would that happen?
Right, so the issue is when you have these small companies, the company as itself will just end up having to
What
close
small
down.
companies? This bill doesn't apply to small companies.
Well, it does because it actually ends up for those with a revenue of 250 million, correct?
That's not a small company. That is a very large
But
revenue.
we're not
How
even
are these companies
talking about companies like Amazon with today's
Mr. Lin.
legislation.
Thank you. So let's talk about companies, why companies start firing workers. Why is that?
They can't afford it.
Okay.
They choose that. They think that it's a more expensive
And
option.
with the minimum
than-
wage, it's even more expensive, so they fire more, right?
But what happens when they turn to automation? Because that's a one-time purchase.
I didn't bring up automation. So
Right, but I'm bringing it up because the thing is, if you move to a $15 minimum wage, they're just going to go to automation. Is that not
it
true?
still gives a direct cash infusion, correct?
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may mute themselves. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. Affirmation speakers. On recency, that goes to Mr. Lin.
Thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber, once again, Senator Lin, LIN, affirmation. That kind of rhymes. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Nod or smile once again. Is anyone not ready? All right. Last summer, I worked in San Francisco. Every day I passed by a towering building with a glossy sign, WeWork. I read articles about this mythic company. They raised billions, had kombucha on tap, and unlimited free beer. But a few months later, when I passed by, all that was left was a worker holding a cardboard sign saying, WeWork never paid us. So how did this happen? Now, last debate, we talked about constructing an economy that works for all Americans. And if there's one thing we can all agree on, that's the priority. And I will continue to establish this as the framework to evaluate this bill. The first reason why I stand on the affirmation is because we need economic justice, and this is the only unique time where we have the leverage to implement that. Now, Senator Brombutt argues that this will take away workers from small businesses. But as Senator Josephson argues, with the lack of action, crises like COVID-19 tend to punish on the largest scale blue-collar workers in large corporations. Now, Senator Jawar cites past buyback history. Let me give you an even deeper history lesson. According to Walter Scheidel 10 days ago with the New York Times, the Black Death led to a shortage of laborers. Workers were able to negotiate higher wages. Even a pandemic in 541 allowed workers to demand for triple wages from the Emperor Justinian. Crisis and pandemic response always strongly determines the possibility of progressive change. And Scheidel says this is especially important now in America. So McKinsey in this month applies this argument to the quarantine. Lockdowns disproportionately affect low-income workers. People who are living paycheck to paycheck do not have this financial cushion. According to Forbes 2 days ago, Amazon deleted calendar invites from workers' calendars in order to stifle protests. The companies are getting desperate, but this is an unprecedented opportunity to encourage companies to equalize the playing field. Senator Yee and Brombutt bring up loopholes, but those loopholes are not net harms. The affirmation has yet to bring up why there's a need for this type of regulation, why there's a net harm to equalize the playing field. But the second reason why I'm on the affirmation is to create better companies. That's because stock buybacks are a pernicious practice, and Senator Jawar already established how rampant the practice is and how they hurt workers. But how do they affect consumers and Americans? According to Rita McGrath on February 26, buybacks stunt allocative efficiency. When you spend $1 on a buyback, you're wasting a dollar that could have been used on investment that could have benefited consumers. Therefore, the need of workers for money right now is more urgent than the want of CEOs to line their pockets through artificially reducing the supply of shares. More than ever, we need to serve as many constituents as possible. Now, Senator Brombutt thinks that workers are going to go to larger corporations, but that's an unrealistic mass movement of labor amidst the pandemic. Let's go back to WeWork. As the company fell due to its reckless behavior, it had to implement drastic measures. It conducted mass layoffs. Buildings closed down. They stopped the flow of free beer. To prevent this from happening again, it's time for Congress to build an economy where not only we work, but that also works for us. Thank you.
Speech time, 3 minutes exactly. Questioners, please raise your placards. We're going to start with Representative Paltzik and move to Representative Viljinski.
Thank you. Great speech, Senator. So my first question, you speak about plagues and pandemics resulting in higher wages for workers, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so what happens when the economy crashes and these companies can no longer afford to pay that?
Well, right now we're giving companies direct cash infusions. The very purpose of this bill is to make it possible for them to afford it.
Sure, but the purpose of this bill only goes to companies with extremely large revenue. So who is it really helping? The people who need it the most, small businesses, or large?
You just said the companies are crashing. I mean, the ones.
Ms. Viljinski.
Hi, Representative. So are companies struggling right now?
Sorry?
Are companies struggling right now during this pandemic? Large companies?
Yeah, definitely. Some of them really are.
Okay, so how do we have leverage to force them to pay workers higher wages if they're already struggling to maintain salaries?
Workers are more likely to unionize. The companies have more inelastic demand.
Right, sure, they can unionize, but can companies support that movement?
Well, they have to if they want to get product.
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. On recency, that will go to Mr. Bogan.
I thank the chair. For the judges, that's Jonathan Bogan, spelled B-O-G-E-N, speaking for the second time in this session on the negation of this legislation. If it helps, I was second on the last bill. Whenever you guys are ready.
Before you start, Mr. Bogan, Mr. Mazumdar, your point of personal privilege is granted.
All right, everyone good? Good, good, and good. All right. I've never been good about paying people back. It's been about 6 years since I promised Senator Josephson that I'd repay him for lunch. And unfortunately, he's probably gonna have to wait 6 more. But as this Congress becomes increasingly indebted to the American people after countless mistakes, we simply push legislation that will only pass the buck once more. Don't let the illusion of redemption tempt us with cheap solutions. So let's see how this legislation completely fails to pay off. Fail this bill because it decreases corporate sustainability. This occurs because we promote third-party block holders by banning stock buybacks. Christopher Small of Harvard Law School finds when the firm's managers are distinct from its owners, they have inadequate incentives to maximize value. Non-corporate entities may acquire large amounts of stock and shift strategy from long-term survival to short-term profits. Mr. Jawar, you say that these stock buybacks benefit companies at the expense of their workers, but what the issue you're addressing is actually block holding in itself, which can happen whether we pass or fail this bill. But under this legislation, it only happens for third parties, and that's extremely dangerous. As the Peterson Institute for the International Economics finds in October of 2019, good corporate governance improves board members' monitoring function, controls shareholders' interests, and helps firm managers make decisions effectively, and attracts higher investment rates. But without that incentive to have good corporate governance, we see that these companies perform worse in the long term, allowing for full-blown economic destruction. Mr. Josephson, if you want to preserve jobs, but under this legislation, you'll only make those jobs unstable by making corporations reckless. If the owners don't actually own the company, they have no reason to grow it. That's the fundamental part we need to see in this debate. But now let's see how this blank check is going to give us a terrible reality check. Fail this bill because it worsens income inequality by increasing executive compensation when we raise the minimum wage. Ben Zipper of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth finds that raising the minimum wage ripples throughout the entire workforce. When the value of labor is increased, wages go up through the ranks of any corporation, and managers are going to want to cut, whether we like it or not. But Mr. Jawar says that the pay limit is the only way to stop minimum wages from sending that rift all the way up to the top. But he recognizes himself that pay is distinct from compensation with stocks, and that's the way they get around this pay limit under this bill. Now, Mr. Yee says that they'll use the restricted stock plans to maintain the wealth gap bit by bit, but it's so much worse than that. They literally own it. There's no restriction. Kerry Bowell of the Harvard Law School finds the last decade has seen a shift towards the use of stock-based pay for executive officers. In fact, stock-based pay comprised 35% of total annual compensation for executives. If they're smart enough to rise to the top of their corporation, they're smart enough to see the gaping hole in this bill. When you pass, executives will increase their benefits by hundreds of millions of dollars, have less money circulating throughout the economy. So Mr. Lin says that this bill sets the standard for change that will benefit workers in the long run, but their wages will have less purchasing power than ever before. So in the end, if you pass, the only thing we'll owe our people is an apology.
Speech time 3 minutes and 7 seconds. Mr. Mazumdar, you may re-enter the chamber. All questioners, please raise your placards. Okay, we will start with Mr. Khan and move to Ms. Wadwa.
Hi, Senators. So Section D states that executive salaries can't exceed 100 times the median salary of a worker. So how are executives going to be able to raise their pay?
I already told you, and a different senator as well, that stock compensation is distinct from a salary. That's how it works. And that's why this legislation is absolutely flawed.
Okay, but then how do you ensure that people are going to be cut for their jobs when Section 2A specifically says people are going to keep current payroll and headcount levels? How do you cut other people from their jobs?
I'm saying that once the economic crisis is over, businesses will be more reckless because owners don't own it.
Ms. Wadwa.
Hi, Senator. So what's more important right now, keeping businesses open or making sure they retain their value?
I think keeping business open.
Okay, so if this legislation is successful in keeping those businesses open and keeping jobs intact,
But it's
why
not
does it matter if corporations lose value?
a flaw in your argument. Businesses fall apart after the crisis because there's no incentive for good corporate governance.
But if they still have workers and they have a chance to increase their value after COVID-19, wouldn't they want to do that?
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. Affirmation speakers on recency, that will go to Mr. Ontiru. Mr. Rodriguez, do you have a motion?
I have a point of inquiry.
Point of
When does
inquiry?
this round end?
This round ends at 1:30 according to the Congress packet.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. For the second time today, that's Ontiru, O-N-T-E-E-R-U, on the affirmation of today's bill. If it helps, I spoke fifth on the last bill. Just let me know when you're ready. Good. Mr. Josephson starts off today's debate by telling all of us that silence can only do so much to solve our past mistakes. But in my eyes, silence is far better than policies that fall to deaf ears, better than empty rhetoric, and better than the world of the negative. Principally understand that today's legislation doesn't just affect Amazon's, Facebook, Google's. It entirely revolutionizes our entire financial industry and solves for wealth inequality in America. Let's introduce a new stakeholder and take down the primary negative argument in my speech today. First, you've passed today's legislation because you stopped the US banking industry's flagrant abuse of policies when it comes to bailouts. As Robert DeYoung in an August 2018 report from the University of Kansas Center for Banking Excellence reports, US banks in the status quo, whether it's Chase, Goldman Sachs, or Bank of America, are either A, publicly traded companies, or B, privately owned. That means that under an affirmative world, every single provision under Section 2 applies to them. Why is this so important? According to a Federal Reserve press release from February of 2016, back in 2008, banks almost took $4 trillion from the United States government with no payback whatsoever. Our government recognizes without the banking industry, we lose the backbone in any policy or economic intervention control we have around the world. As a direct result, we cradle to every single one of their mistakes. Why does today's legislation change that? Under Section 2, because now banks are included, we have some regulation over them, first of all. But second, we're making sure they follow basic policies that change and make the playing field far more equal. As a direct result, now banks are being held accountable, not just companies. That is the most important impact in today's debate. But next, recognize down the bench on the other side, the one I'm opposing, they continue making the argument that executive salaries and the wage gap continue to grow. This is primarily propagated by first, Senator Brombach, who talks about stocks and wages, and second, Senator Lynn, who talks about the wage gap in his second contention. Let's understand that by basic logic, that isn't true. As Eric Posner of the UChicago Law Journal tells us in 2018, first, stocks give a better incentive to companies' workers to continue working harder and by mandating better corporate ownership, because now they have a direct role in the fate of the company. Senator Bogan makes the assumption that if we pass today's legislation, companies go down the drain because you have worse corporate ownership. That's false. Now, the workers and the people have the power. They mandate change. In addition to that, under Section 2A of today's legislation, remember, you're increasing minimum wage to $15. Why is that so significant? The top 1.1% of the United States doesn't control the economy. It's the bottom 99%. When you're empowering the middle and lower class, when you're giving them spending power and control over organizations, you institute real change. Mr. Josephson tells us that silence isn't the solution. I agree. Don't let the other side convince you of that.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 6 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. We will start with Ms. Lahiri and move to Ms. Veljunski.
Hi, great speech.
Hi.
So why do companies do stock buybacks in the status quo?
Okay, so companies do stock buybacks because it helps inflate their own value when they're really
Okay, right. So companies inherently want to make their investors happy, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so what are other ways that companies can increase their value if not to do stock buybacks?
I mean, there are a number of different ways, but you have to remember that now the investors are
Okay.
the workers in the company. That's like
Okay, so the most common way that companies do this is they increase the prices of their goods. If companies increase the price of their goods, how do low-income individuals afford them?
Inflation trends are determined by the
Ms.
Fed, not by
Belyansky.
the companies themselves.
Hi. So what was the main reason that banks failed in 2008?
In 2008, it was because of their own negligence when it came to mortgage pricing.
So was part of the reason a lack of capital that they weren't mandated to hold?
No, what I'm saying is that on their own mistake, they failed, but our government needs banks. Now
Okay, but right now, do banks and other large companies hold enough capital to support themselves in a recession?
I would say not. Like JP Morgan Chase is about to.
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves. Negation speakers, please raise your placards. Okay, on recency, that is going to go to Ms. Lahiri.
Awesome. That's Ms. Lahiri speaking for the second time today. I spoke fourth on the first bill, if that helps. Just do a smile or nod whenever you're ready. Everyone good? Okay. In this world, there are a lot of things that are too small. Our social spending, climate change investment, and education funding. But unfortunately, in this world, size does matter. We need big industries to be on our side right now, which is exactly why we negate. This debate can be distilled into two nexus questions. The first is buybacks. At this point, the affirmative is ahead on the question of whether buybacks are good or not, because my colleagues have let Mr. Jawar's generalizations about this govern the debate. Now, I'll distinguish myself from Ms. Yi and Ms. Brombutt. I agree with Mr. Jawar and Mr. Lin that buyback policy probably won't be circumvented, but allow me to assuage your concerns. First, buybacks right now are uniquely good. During times of crisis, Motley Fool writes just last month that this would be the worst possible time to eliminate buybacks because the funding is, quote, discretionary and can be stopped or started at any time, and thus the money can be diverted to fund COVID-19 relief operations or any means to combat unprecedented societal concerns. This money is uniquely critical to combating societal concerns that may arise out of the blue, which is exactly why they're important. But let's say buybacks are bad. Let's examine what important industries do when we eliminate their ability to buy back stocks, specifically pharma. Pharma doesn't like it when they face a revenue square, and according to the balance in 2017, they merge. This is exactly why the Institute for Health and Social Policy finds in 2016 that after a merger, these firms reduce their R&D budgets by over 20%. The implications are twofold. The first is economic growth loss. The National Bureau of Economic Research quantifies that in the past 50 years, medical innovation has been the source of nearly half of all the GDP growth in the United States due to life expectancy gains, which is exactly why the article concludes that if we impose checks on pharma right now, we would not be able to, quote, survive the COVID-19 pandemic. But the second impact is affordable healthcare. Janssen Global explains in 2018 that every dollar decrease in innovation increases the cost of healthcare by $7. This evidence wins the round for the negative because in a time of COVID-19, we need healthcare more than anything else. Mr. Ontario, I understand bank regulation would be nice, but they are causing lives to be lost. But still, affirmative speakers are more interested in cutting lifelines than reaching finish lines. The second question in the debate is that of minimum wage. The only implication of an increase in minimum wage is not about job instability or firing more workers. It's the companies increase the cost of their products. It doesn't matter if people unionize because the Heritage Foundation finds in 2017 that low-income families will bear the brunt of increased product costs, which companies do to make their investors happy. And specifically, this puts $240 million into the toxic cycle of poverty, a number that the New York Times predicts just last month will be far greater than the similar implications due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The affirmative has tried to win the line by line, but we will win life by life. At the end of the day, what matters to me are my constituents, and I hope that they matter to you too.
It's a speech of 3 minutes exactly. Questioners, please raise your placards. Okay, we will start with Mr. Burkhart and then go to Mr. Ontiru.
Okay, you said that the income raise the prices to satisfy the investors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, who are the investors under today's piece of legislation if we give every single employee a stock plan?
I mean, here's the issue. So the first is that even if like some employees get the money, the most of the company's funding comes from outside investors. They want to make these outside investors happy and give them money. So obviously they charge higher prices for their products.
Okay, and if the prices increase, doesn't the increase in wages be able
Mr.
to counter that, or will it not?
Amazon probably
No, I
has
don't think
more workers at minimum wage than the executive level, right?
Okay.
So, under today's legislation, if we're giving those minimum wage workers the means of ownership, doesn't that mean that they can exert control over the company?
Okay, no, that doesn't make any sense because the problem is that these stockholders are not just the employees. The problem is even if you give them a stock buyback plan, that doesn't increase their share of ownership compared to rich people who
Minimum
own
wage
shares.
employees are in greater number than the executives.
Questioning time has
No, it's not
elapsed. The
about-
speaker
it's not
may
about
mute
the numbers.
themselves.
Thank you.
Seeing as though the negation speech affirmation speakers, please raise your placards. On recency, that will go to Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. For the second and final time today, or in this session rather, that's Christian Rodriguez, whenever my judges are ready. Just give me one moment to grab my timer and then I'll begin. And I'm assuming my presiding officer is ready.
Always.
Beautiful. I am proud to serve in one of the wealthiest nations this world has ever seen. Countries across the world look to America to see what we are going to do, how we are going to influence the world. And yet at the same time, we continue to value the 1% over the 99%. We continue to make sure income inequality is the #1 problem in our country. And I am proud to pass a bill that finally fixes that problem and takes care of those who matter most. Let's separate this debate into the two biggest issues and understand why the affirmative wins both. First, on the matter of minimum wage, I am even surprised that negative keeps bringing this up because every single time they do, they just keep getting destroyed by the affirmative. Let's go to this argument brought up by Representatives Brombat and Yee. This legislation causes job loss for one simple reason. Minimum wage causes companies to lose money and therefore they have to cut jobs. It's a very simple warrant and it's been said many times. Unfortunately, this just blatantly ignores Section 2A, which says you can't reduce payroll. It makes logically no sense how these companies can all of a sudden cut jobs if under federal law, after you pass this bill, they are illegally barred from doing so. But then Representative Lahiri tells you that this legislation will cause inflation, meaning that those who are hit hardest during the coronavirus pandemic would be unable to afford goods. I agree, inflation should be a concern, but think about this logically. If all of these people are struggling in the status quo right now, millions of people are barely affording goods, how would companies stay afloat if they rose prices that people can't afford? It makes no logical sense, and it has to be outweighed by the benefits of a minimum wage. Because the Congressional Budget Office conducted an analysis last year and found on July 9th of 2019 that a $15 minimum wage, as proposed under this legislation, would lift 1.3 million people out of poverty, the majority of which are under companies that are applying under this legislation. We raise people out of poverty. We make sure big companies and big executives don't get all the benefits. And most importantly, we represent the 99%. But then the next clash point comes from stock buybacks. Whether or not these benefit the people or the companies, let's definitively say it's best for both worlds. Here is why. The Harvard Business Review on January 7th of 2020 found that stock buybacks are used by wealthy executives to increase their wage at the top and in turn worsen income equality. Let's change the narrative real quick. Stock buybacks aren't being used by companies because they're in this precarious situation and they're going to go into bankruptcy if they don't do it. They're doing it to increase their own wealth. But Representative Bogan will tell you that this is really bad for corporate wealth and we're only going to see more bankruptcies in the long term because of instability. But take into consideration two things. One, Representative Ontario's response where he tells you that when you have less stock buybacks, more power goes to the people and that's a net benefit because it actually increases stability. And two, I'd argue it's much more important to value the lives of people who are struggling than the lives of those at the top of companies for the sake of preserving equity. Pass this legislation.
Speech time, 3 minutes and 9 seconds. Questioners, please raise your placards. For questioning, we will start with Ms. Brombat and finally go to Mr. Ma.
Hi, Ms. Brombot.
Section 2A refer to companies above or below the $250 threshold?
Above 250 million.
Right. So if they have to keep current payroll, that will still happen, right? Because most Fortune 500 companies already pay their employees $15 minimum wage, right?
I mean, you have to look at companies like McDonald's and like these large multinational corporations who are
Okay,
like, paying
so let's
less
look,
than minimum wage.
now that we've established that this only applies to large $250 $1 million businesses, what
Right.
happens to the small businesses who can't afford to pay their employees above?
They're not applied under this bill. It only applies to big businesses. Small businesses
So
don't have to
those
pay this minimum
people
wage.
are going to want to look towards larger businesses, right?
Hi, Senator. So
Hi, Mr. Ma.
normally, like under normal circumstances, when prices increase, people like choose not to buy. It's not that they can't like afford to buy them, but they choose not to because
Here's
the
my
price is
problem
higher,
with the
right?
inflation argument, right? Hypothetically, in like a nationwide minimum wage, that would happen. But this is being applied to large corporations who can afford to take a few hits to like their revenue. It's
Okay,
not like
but
if they
do,
don't
like in the
raise-
past, have they done that? Have they cut from their own profits rather than increasing prices?
They can afford to cut from their own profits.
Questioning time has elapsed. The speaker may mute themselves.
Thank you.
Is there a motion, Mr. Jawar?
I move to the previous question.
Is there a second? Should be everybody because we have reached our hard stop. Okay, I'm going to assume unanimous consent and we will now move to the previous question. All who wish to pass this legislation, please raise your placard. Give me just a second so I don't make another counting mistake. Everybody raising 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All who wish to fail. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, we have a vote of 8 to 8. And seeing as that allows me to decide, once again, the negation has convinced me, and thus I will vote on the negation. So we fail both pieces of legislation that we've discussed today. Additionally, I just want to thank everybody for working through this today as we try to adapt to this debate tournament online. And just as a summary, we've got through 25 speeches and 57 questions in the time that we were allotted for the semifinal round. So great job to everybody. But I will hand it back to the party now.
Thanks. So we'll end our session here and then everyone needs to be back. We have an hour and a half break. We need to be back here at 3 o'clock Eastern time and we'll start again. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. You guys at 3.
Thank you for a good session.